Again. And you don't want to get too close because it distorts.
I've seen that with. We're about to begin. If I can get folks seated. My name is Cesar Perales, and I have the honor of serving as chair of the 2018 New York City Charter Revision Commission. Even though all of the commissioners are not here yet, I'm going to start and ask the folks that are up here to introduce themselves. Well, let me begin with the gentleman on my right.
Good afternoon. My name is John Siegel, and I'm obviously a member of the Charter Revision Commission, and proud to say I'm a law school, and I practice law in New York with the firm Baker and Hostetler.
As I indicated, my name is Cesar Perales, but in terms of my own background, I'm a former deputy mayor of New York City. I am most recently, I served as Secretary of State of New York. I've had a long history in government, and in my other hat, I've served as President and General Counsel of Latino Justice, Puerto Rican Legal Defense and Education Fund. Anita, will you introduce yourself?
Good afternoon. My name is Aneta Sicharan, and I am the Executive Director of Chaya Community Development Corporation.
Good afternoon. My name is Marco Carrion. I currently serve as the Commissioner of the Mayor's Office of Community Affairs.
Good afternoon. My name is Una Clark. I'm a former member of the New York City Council and trustee for the City University of New York. I'm honored to be here and to serve.
Good afternoon. My name is Wendy Weiser. I direct the Democracy Program at the Brennan Center for Justice at NYU Law School, and thank you for coming here today.
Well, let me just make a few opening remarks. Today's meeting is open to the public, although we will not be taking questions or comments from the public. This is a meeting that the Commission requested so that we could hear from experts on some of the particular issues that have arisen in our borough meetings and through email and through other ways in which we have sought the input of the citizens of New York about what they would like to see changed in the New York City Charter. So it's being live streamed. Folks can see us now, or they can tune in later and watch us at any time, so that we are very cognizant of that. We have a deaf interpreter. We think we are ready to roll, as they say. But let me tell you about today's forum. This is the last of our issue forums. Today, in this particular panel, I think we'll talk more generally about the issue that seems to underlie much of what we had heard, and that has to do with civic engagement in its broadest sense. While much of it has been focused on the elections and encouraging people to vote, much of it has to do with getting people involved in the civic life of New York City. So we are especially interested in hearing from you about what you do today. What is New York City doing in terms of trying to encourage civic engagement? And perhaps more importantly, what do you think we can change in the city charter that will increase civic engagement, the civic life of our city? Why don't well, I should have done this already, but let me just introduce the members of the panel. Naomi Zorderer, who's the chair of the New York City Voter Assistance Advisory Committee. She's accompanied by Amy Loprest, the executive director. And we will also hear from Paula Gavin, who is the chief service officer of New York City. Matt, do you have some ground rules or opening remarks you'd like to make? Matt is our executive director.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Sure. Really, just very briefly on the format and for the commissioners on questions. So we have quite a few panels today and panelists, and to facilitate the process, the way we've designed the session is for the panelists to speak for 5 minutes. I'll give you a 1 minute warning through the microphone, and after each panelist, the commissioners should feel free to ask questions, but try to confine those questions to ones relating.
We're going to try to see if we can hold up questions till the panelists have spoken, and then have ask questions of all of you.
So there you have it. That's it from me, Mr. Chair. Thanks very much.
With that,
Mr. Chairman, may I be allowed to just identify somebody in the room that I've worked with a long time, especially around voter community involvement, also works for the city of New York. Anita Myers, her husband is one of my dearest friends. I mentored him from Medgar College. He's a distinguished lawyer and a former student trustee for the City University of New York. So Anita, she does great work with voter assistance also.
nice of you to join us. We appreciate.
Well, I was planning on identifying her herself, and Anita's the Director of Voter Assistance for the City of New York. So thank you very much, Ms. Clark. Thank you.
Well, let's get right to it. Naomi, you have the floor.
Thank you for the opportunity to provide testimony about how the Campaign Finance Board fosters civic engagement by encouraging New Yorkers to participate in their democracy. We believe that participating in elections is essential to being an active citizen, whether that is through registration and voting, contributing to a candidate, volunteering, or running for office. Our government has a public interest in engaging its citizens, so New Yorkers can elect those who truly represent them. It is therefore critical that government play a role in conducting outreach to voters, regardless of political party, particularly in an age where campaigns can more narrowly target prime voters and when local media coverage of neighborhood politics is shrinking. The CFB is ideally situated to fill this role because we are an independent, nonpartisan agency. Voter engagement is a key element of our agency mission, and it is written into the charter that the CFB, quote, encourage, promote, and facilitate voter registration and voting by all residents of New York City who are eligible to vote, unquote. We conduct this work through our NYC Votes initiative. Prior to a 2010 charter revision, the Voter Assistance Commission was a 16-member body with a small staff located within the mayor's office. The 2010 Charter Revision Commission recommended that VAC be dissolved and reformed as the Voter Assistance Advisory Committee within the Campaign Finance Board. VAC, which is a with two A's, which is a 9-member advisory board appointed by the city's elected officials, advises the CFB on several mandates outlined in the city charter. VAC's responsibility is to encourage voter registration and voting by all eligible New York City residents and recommend methods to increase the rate of registration and voting. More specifically, we identify underrepresented groups throughout the city and undertake activities to encourage voter registration and voting by all residents, including limited English proficient voters. The work of NYC Votes is outlined in detail in our written testimony and in the 2018 annual report. I want to highlight a few items. There are 715,000 New Yorkers who are eligible but not registered to vote. Each year, we register thousands of voters at voter registration drives. We recently worked with City Hall and the Department of Education to coordinate Student Voter Registration Day in city high schools, where we collected over 10,000 voter registration forms. We trained frontline staff at city agencies covered by Local Law 29, which requires staff at 25 city agencies and all 59 community boards to assist voters with completing their voter registration forms. In 2016, we worked with the Mayor's Office of Immigrant Affairs to translate the voter registration forms into 11 new languages. As we work to make sure every eligible voter can register to vote, the real challenge in New York City is getting people to turn out to the polls. In the 2017 citywide elections, 3.45 million registered voters stayed home in the general election. Last year, we conducted public opinion research into why voters participate in presidential elections, but sit out for local elections. Our major finding was that voters care deeply about the issues that affect their communities, but lack the information they need about upcoming elections and the candidates who are running for office. Our priority each election is connecting voters with that information. For city elections, we produce a print, online, and video voter guide with candidate profiles. The print guide is sent to every registered voter. We also publish a guide online for state and federal elections. The primary election guide had over 225,000 online visitors, while the general guide had over 303,000 visitors. In 2017, we widely advertised the guide and our voting information platform, voting.nyc, in public transit and outdoor locations, in print and on TV and on social media. The CIA administers the debate program for candidates running for mayor, public advocate, and comptroller. In the 2017 election, a pilot in open city council districts where we partnered with community organizations to put on candidate forums. We anticipate scaling this program up in 2021, where we anticipate up to 40 open council seats. In addition to sharing information with voters through NYC Votes on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, last year we implemented a new text and email outreach program. Over 2,300 voters signed up to receive election alerts in advance of the 2017 election, and we are working to expand this to more voters. We also conduct GeoTV phone banking before each election and call thousands of new voters with our volunteers and partner organizations.
We have about 1 minute remaining.
These are just brief highlights of the work we do to engage voters each year. There is greater detail in our full testimony, which has been provided to the Commission, along with our most recent voter assistance report. We're happy to answer any questions that you may have.
Thank you. You're just here in support, Amy?
Yes, just to answer
All right.
questions.
Then let me turn immediately to Paula Gavin.
Thank you so very much. I appreciate the opportunity to talk about something near and dear to my heart. I will say I was told I had 8 minutes. I'm going to talk really, really fast. So I want to cover a couple of key points. So first of all,
be assured that we have read your submission, including the results of your survey. We're very familiar, so don't repeat anything that you've given us in writing.
Super. So let me start by just presenting to you how we define civic engagement. We believe that civic engagement is the empowerment of constructive resident voice to both influence and connect individuals to city issues and city services. We believe that that can be done through community outreach, organizing, volunteering, voting, and civic leadership. And as a result, that enhances government's public value and the quality of life for all. NYC Service is a division of the Mayor's Office. It was created in 2009 by Mayor Bloomberg, in part and in response to President Barack Obama's increased emphasis on service. Mayor de Blasio affirmed and really amplified the work of NYC Service starting in 2014. Our mission, pretty simple. We promote, we engage New Yorkers in volunteer service, build the capacity for volunteers, and seek to mobilize volunteers for the city's greatest issues. Our vision is that we would like to inspire every New Yorker to volunteer for their city and each other. We do this through 5 major goals: by promoting volunteerism through traditional methodologies, websites, media, but also being in neighborhoods. Secondly, we actually grow and develop volunteer programs with city agencies and CBOs, and we have a specific focus on youth and youth leadership. We also have national service programs, which are in the communities, both with CBOs and city agencies providing service. Public-private partnerships is our fourth goal. We engage about 250 corporations in our work. And finally, we're building capacity by working with city agencies and CBOs. So we have indeed a portfolio of activities that's all about enhancing and increasing volunteerism. We know through the census and the U.S. household survey that the national average of volunteering is 25%. We rank as a city quite low. We have been 14%, the metro area is 18%. So we've done a number of things. One is to analyze that data and understand it. The second is to get out into the community. We did a pilot in Western Queens, and we found that in this pilot door-to-door, 48% of those residents said they volunteered, a distinct difference. We've initiated volunteer work in neighborhoods, 5 this year, expanding to 15, where we're bringing the neighborhoods together to communicate better about volunteerism, to build the capacity, and to track the volunteerism. We do a report every year called Volunteers Count. I think an exhibit here, which basically asks city agencies and neighborhood organizations to talk about volunteering. It's a total of about 550,000 are reported, and that has really enabled us to engage over 800 nonprofits as well as our city agencies in volunteer work. We also do a mayoral service recognition program. This year we recognize 4,600 residents for 100 hours or more of service. And finally, we are about to issue a survey which will mirror the national survey, census survey, and we'll go out to New Yorkers asking, do they volunteer? How are they civically engaged? Which is going to give us a tremendous amount of neighborhood data on why people are volunteering, why they're not, and really enable us to compare to this national data. So I want to just comment very briefly on the continuum of civic engagement. A couple of years ago, we really embraced the notion that multiple agencies needed to come together, NYC Service, the Community Affairs Unit, the Public Engagement Unit. And we've been doing a lot of work with them as a group to really connect our work. Public Engagement Unit out in the community, making people aware of services. Community Affairs Unit, connecting communities to the work and the services of our city. Certainly volunteering through NYC Service, and really civic leadership being a major part of what we've done both with CAU, but also within NYC Service. So we've tried to create the continuum of civic engagement by cooperating and working together. I will comment that Democracy NYC, which was announced at the State of the City, is really a framework to bring all this work together. I deeply believe that by connecting the work of both city agencies, city council, borough presidents, community boards, we can indeed enhance not only civic engagement, but the rate of volunteerism and the rate of voting. It is shown that those who volunteer more vote more, those who vote more volunteer more. So the tide will rise, and we really want to engage more people in the work of volunteering as well as voting. And finally, I just will end with the fact that as 8.6 million New Yorkers together serving each other, we've tried to work at the individual level, the neighborhood level, the organizational level, as well as the city level, as well as the corporate level, to really address the opportunities for volunteering, as well as the benefits of volunteering. There is research that you live longer, you're happier, and you're healthier if you volunteer. So there's a good reason to do it on both sides.
That means the members of this commission will live longer because we are all volunteering. I mean, given that, Mendy, would you introduce yourself?
Yes, my name is Mendy Marachnik. I'm Staten Island Council of Jewish Organizations. I'm honored to be a member of this great commission, humbled to be here this afternoon, hearing your testimony.
Let me just exercise the prerogative of the chair, as I often do, and ask the first question. How closely do both of you work?
There are volunteers I know that support them, but we have not had a formal collaboration.
We work with a lot of different city agencies, but we take volunteers from the NYC Service volunteers for different programs over the years.
Okay. Well, let me ask one other question, which is I've had on my mind for some time, has to do with registration, voter registration. When I was with the state government, we took great pride in the fact that the Department of Motor Vehicles was registering an enormous number of people. They actually do the registration themselves, as I understand it, and send the material to the Board of Elections. Is that the way it works, Amy?
Yeah.
Do you guys do any of that? What agency in the city of New York does something similar to DMV?
Well, the DMV is one of the few agencies that's actually allowed to collect the registration data and transmit it directly to as part of the voter registration process. But there are a number of city agencies that are charged with the under the charter, charged with the responsibility of encouraging and getting people to register to vote as part of their work. So, but those people basically fill out paper forms. So, you know, one agency is the Department of Social Service. They would, or the Department of Citywide Administrative Services. There's a lot of different agencies, but they fill out a paper form, and then, you know, that's part of one of their forms that people fill out, and that form gets mailed back to the Board of Elections. It's not direct.
I understand. Is there a reason why city agencies are precluded from doing what the DMV does? Is there a legal reason?
There's a complicated legal reason. We are actually, the City Council passed a law earlier this year that directs the Campaign Finance Board to build an online voter registration portal. And that voter registration portal will be available to all New York City residents for people to register online. You can also register online or change your registration online with the Department of Motor Vehicles right now. The Board of Elections, in their interpretation of the state law, has said that they haven't made a definitive decision, so I'm not, you know, they're still investigating this, that they require a wet signature to process a voter registration form, so that someone would have to print a form and sign it, and then in order for them to be able to legally, under state election law, process that registration form. The state attorney general issued a opinion saying that they thought that the state election law would allow an electronic version of a signature. So as we're building our online voter registration portal, we are working out the issues related to that.
I have a few questions, so thank you so much. This is really helpful, and I very much appreciate the valuable work being done by both of your agencies. One of the proposals that have been put forward before this commission is to create a new office of civic engagement somewhere housed within the city. I was interested in hearing your guys' thoughts on the benefits of such a proposal, and where you think that would best be housed, and how you think, and whether you think that should encompass or collaborate with your offices, you know, how you think that. So it's really for both of you.
Sure. So we actually, I think, you know, the idea of increasing and the civic engagement work of the city is a great idea, and coordinating it better. But we do recommend keeping back at the CFB. The CFB has added resources and built expertise to expand the work since it was moved to the agency in 2010. And we take a really comprehensive approach to educating voters, encouraging democratic participation, volunteering, running for office. Our research shows that voters feel that they do not have the information they need to participate in elections. We've developed a very comprehensive system for providing that information, and are continuing to improve on that through, for instance, the debates for open city council races that I referred to earlier. So one of our main focuses is providing voters with information. Because of our existing relationship with the candidates on the campaign finance side, we are able to work with them to submit profiles and video statements for the voter guide so that voters get the information they need from all of the candidates. So it really makes sense to keep that the voter outreach and the voter information housed with the campaign finance board.
And what do you think, just to follow up, and I'm interested in your, but what do you think about how you would work with, if there were such an office, how would your office work with that office, and where would you like to see that office housed if it existed? Would you, or do you have a thought on that?
Since I'm a volunteer myself, I'm going to ask Amy to answer that question.
Yes.
So I think we would support the idea that it would be an independent and nonpartisan, that any organization that's called an Office of Civic Engagement be a nonpartisan and independent agency, because I think that insulates it from any kind of political pressures or the desire to follow any particular person's priorities, and at least that would at least give the appearance, even if the elected official was not pushing it, the appearance of that. And so, and as Naomi said, I think that we feel that the work really dovetails very well. The voter engagement work that we do fits very comprehensively in the campaign finance work that we spoke about last week, as part of our mission. I think that what would happen if it was a separate organization is that we would work very hard. I mean, there are many, many aspects of civic engagement, as we've just heard, as we've heard from other proposals, and that if we worked on the voter engagement and outreach work that we're doing, that we would work very closely with that Office of Service to collaborate and build a collaborative relationship so that they would support each other and, as bring both voter registration and overall civic participation up.
So I do feel strongly that a framework that brings together the various aspects of civic engagement would be very important. I think that the elements feed each other. Knowledge of community feeds involvement in community feeds wanting improvements in your community, and eventually also voting for people who match your values. So I do think a framework would be very valuable. I don't know that it has to be everything working within the one framework. I think it's more of a coordinating effort that would be valuable, because many city agencies are doing community outreach. To try to put them all in one place is just not realistic. But I know from my 4 years of doing this work, if there was an interagency vehicle to bring together those elements that were working on it and sharing what they were doing and being held accountable for different metrics, it could be very valuable. I think Democracy NYC was described as one of those frameworks, and the Office of Civic Engagement kind of might be another name for the same thing. I do work for the mayor, so I'd love that it would be in the mayor's office, but I think it's more important that we think about what's the most effective way to get these various elements to work together.
Dr. Clark?
Yeah, I just wanted to take a fresh look at what are we calling civic engagement, and whether in fact a community as the one from which I come, if one would say my role in society, so that people understand that they have a role to play in our society, would be better. So as we have new immigrant communities and we want to embrace them and want them to participate, do you have a prescription if we were to create an office? And for me, it would be nonpartisan, because I wouldn't want to get, excuse my language, a crazy mayor who don't like what we put together and then it goes away. If we put something together that is going to help New York and help all New Yorkers, it has to be independent of the politics that may play from time to time, so that if it's created to be permanent, so that we engage people as they come and make sure that they feel uplifted. Do you have a recommendation as to what that would look like? I propose, where I come from, you have to learn what it is to be a good citizen in school. So it's a whole different atmosphere. So I wanted to ask you, if we were to look at what children learn early, so that by the time they get to be of age to vote, that they would know that it's a responsibility. Where would we put that?
So I would first say that what we've learned when we've been at the community levels and neighborhood levels is it starts with communications. People want to know what is going on, and then they want to know what opportunities to address what's going on for something they care about. We have seen in this study that we did in the neighborhood, the people want to get engaged. They often don't know how to. They often don't know where their own interest matches what the opportunities are. So I think it does start with a vehicle to communicate at the neighborhood level, let people know what can be done at the neighborhood level, how you can use your talent. So it may not be a fresh start, but I think it has to be a comprehensive start, has to be in multiple languages, it has to speak to people and the culture they come from. But I think we've seen that once you do that, people do want to be a part of their community.
Thank you.
Well, I'll turn to you, Annetta, but I just want a clarification. I think, let me rephrase the question. Do any of you work with the school system? And how?
So we work extensively with the school system.
And teach civic, get them to learn civics?
Yes, from the civic point of view, and there's two main things we do. One is to work with the Department of Ed on what's called service in schools, which is an opportunity for young people early in their life to learn about how they can contribute to their community. The other is a huge initiative that we've started, which is to get teenagers at high school level on youth leadership councils, learning about the issues and being part of solving them at precincts, at schools, at city agencies. So we have focused on the volunteer aspect of young people.
That's a little different than making sure that there's civics taught in the schools. Any interest in that?
Well, we we've been involved in, and we just finished a project called the Student Voter Registration Day. Now it is a one-day program, but it does teach civics and encourage people to get students to register. But as part of the daily program, and while it varied, it was across all high schools in New York City this year. The program varied slightly in each high school, but each one included a component of what civic participation looks like, what it means to vote, what are the rights and responsibilities involved in voting, as part of encouraging young people to register to vote. But again, I don't think that there is any civics education per se. I think that it's part of the social studies curriculum in New York City, but I don't think there's any particular program that goes from young children up through high school.
Yeah, so I just wonder if we can agree on a common definition for civic engagement, as some indicators for success, because I think depending where we sit, we all have a different perspective. I hear you talk about voter participation. I hear you talk about volunteerism, though they do feed each other, and as you well said. So, but what might be some other indicators and for success if we were to really take this on? It just seems sort of like very broadly defined, all over the place. What would be different? What would it look like? What would success look like?
So, the definition that we put forward really starts with giving residents a voice. So part of the metrics is seeing how they are using that voice. So it can be town halls, it can be community problem solving, it can be community boards. So you can look at the organizing mechanisms and measure how much individuals get involved, which I think is one thing that is an opportunity for us. The second is volunteering. It definitely is an element of that. The third is voter, both registration but engagement. Those are the kind of hard things that you could look at. There are certainly studies that say public safety demonstrates when a community comes together that there are results in public safety. There's been data around employment statistics too. But those are kind of the result of all those other things. But I would like to just put forth that I think the key definition is really that we're giving residents voices so individuals can both influence and be connected to the city in new ways, and then measuring how those ways show up.
So I'm sort of personally very involved, civically involved, And I had the privilege of running two organizations that emphasize civic engagement. And I think that really the reality is that even if we do have this new office, this proposed office of civic engagement, not quite a new office yet, that it seems to me that something else needs to happen in communities, in neighborhoods, to make any real effort successful, which is additional infrastructure. Because there could be all the great outreach and all the education, but unless there's real partnership and infrastructure and real entry points and places for connection, then I'm not really sure where it all lands. And I wonder if you could speak to that, maybe some thoughts you might have around that in terms of the
communications infrastructure, quite honestly, because as we went into Western Queens and then 4 additional neighborhoods, it is about people knowing kind of how do I take my interest in the environment? How do I learn more? So I think there is a communications infrastructure that would and is necessary for people to know how to act on a concern they have or how to act on an interest they have. So I do agree with you, and that's about really people being aware of what's going on in their community. And to me, community boards are one vehicle, and I think amplifying the communications aspect.
Yes, go ahead, because I'm about to thank the panel. So,
Well, I could, this is just speaking for myself, okay, but I could imagine having, resource centers, community-based resource centers, where people, could access information about organizations that are active in their communities, the candidates who represent them. And they should be really beautiful public spaces too. I think it's so unfortunate that we have, like, people often end up voting in the most dingy public spaces that we have, and it's we need to. I think you make a good point. We need to take the Office of Civic Engagement into the entire city.
And I would add something that's brought up, just so as you're thinking about this, that's important, is that part of our work is to look at populations that are underrepresented and figure out, what barriers those people, those communities have. And I think, limited English proficiency, people who are homeless, people who are, in the involved with the Department of Corrections, all of those populations are underrepresented in civic engagement. And as we think about this, thinking of ways that, make sure that you reach people both culturally, but in the, in the languages that they can access, and in, from agencies, in coordination with agencies that are already working with them. I mean, there are many city agencies that already are working with these populations. To make sure that there's coordination with those agencies is very important.
my thanks to all three of you. This has been very, very helpful. I'd ask the members of the next panel to get ready and take their seats. Our fourth panelist is joining us. All right. Is everybody I don't know if all of you were here when Matt Gawal, our executive director, was laying down the ground rules. What we'd like to do is to have each of you speak for no more than 5 minutes, and then we will hold our questions till all four of you have had an opportunity to speak, and then we will ask questions. It's his job to be the bad guy and let you know when you've got 1 minute remaining, because the commissioners are too nice to do that. So with that, let me turn to the panel that will be discussing engaging communities. And I will first introduce each one of you. Elizabeth O'Young, Denora Getachew, Ifioma Ike, and Susan Duha. So let me begin in the order in which I introduced them, with Elizabeth O'Young.
Thank you so much for inviting me to come and speak on this very critical and timely issue. The one thing that I want to talk about as far as engaging immigrant communities is that it's important, as I think was emphasized in the previous panel, that if known about the opportunities immigrant communities want to help, they understand that this is their neighborhood, this is their town, this is their city, this is their state, they want to help. But the avenue, as which Commissioner Citrin alluded to enable immigrant communities to know about it, is to build the infrastructure with the very groups that these immigrant communities have trust in. And so the community-based organizations are essential to build the capacity of these community-based organizations to do the education, outreach, and coordination with city volunteer opportunities and efforts for civic engagement. Another very key, important, trusted community base are social service organizations in the communities, as well as churches, mosques, and other religious entities. And we've seen that play out, the way that these established, trusted community organizations have led to volunteerism in the immigrant communities on a number of instances. 9/11, post 9/11, most importantly, in rescue efforts and relief efforts, in rebounding efforts in the community. We've seen that play out in Asian American communities and communities and African communities coming together on issues that impact all of us, like breast cancer, and coming out in strong at the March Against Breast Cancer in October every year. We see that with Arab American Association of New York and partnering with Shore Roads Parks Conservation to clean up and beautify Shore Road. We see that with Chinese Mountain Club of New York cleaning up the New York, New Jersey trail maintenance, and the list goes on and on. But I think it's important to, when you engage communities, to understand that their contribution is not only if they can speak English, but if they don't speak English at all, that there are so many opportunities for volunteerism in the aging communities of immigrant communities with children, et cetera, et cetera. But it's a two-way street. If you were to encourage volunteerism in the immigrant community, it has to be, a comprehensive strategy that also includes their involvement in democratic policy decision-making. For instance, I remember wearing my other hat as a former president of OCA New York. This was the special election in Congressional District 11, former Michael Grimm's district. And there was a special election. And if it weren't for the community-based groups, mobilizing the communities to come out and vote, you would never have known there was a special election going on. You saw very little to no effort by the Board of Elections, putting out news about the special election. And it was most definitely the community-based groups knocking on doors to get people out there to vote. Similarly, as we've seen with the Shazas test and all the controversy around that, I think it's really important to involve immigrant communities in that debate. Immigrant communities, just like the Caucasian community, are not monolithic. There are different views. I, for instance, am very much for affirmative action. And yet, the various voices of the community were not involved in the formation of certain decisions. And I think that that's very important.
1 minute remaining.
Similarly, I think there's an opportunity now for the census. I know Ms. Gavin's office has reached out to the New York Immigration Coalition, wearing my hat as a coordinator of New York Counts 2020, over 50 organizations across the state advocating for a fair and accurate census. I think that's a good first start. And it's these combined efforts to include all the way, not just in volunteerism in the local community, but volunteerism that's also tied with democratic policies and decision-making that leads to an increased importance and knowledge of civic engagement in the area of voting, and particularly naturalization and registering to vote and exercising their right to vote. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Getachew?
Good afternoon, members of the Charter Revision Commission. My name is Denora Getachew. I am the New York City Executive Director of Generation Citizen. We are a 9-year-old national nonprofit focused on educating and empowering the next generation of civically engaged leaders. America is experiencing a civic reckoning, partly as a result of the aftermath of the tragic events in Parkland, Florida, and the incredible leadership and vision shown by those young leaders in the face of their tragedy, but also due to the particularly politically divisive climate we are living in right now. Society is finally realizing what many academics and advocates, those of you who've been in this work for a very long time, already know. Political disengagement and illiteracy are rampant, especially in our city, but also in our most underserved communities. Generation Citizen lays the civic foundation through our Action Civics program. We partner with middle and high schools to implement a new and engaging pedagogy that we call Action Civics, where we are helping students learn about how government works by directly engaging with government to solve a local problem facing their community. So it is not just the theory of democracy or civics. It is not rote memorization or schoolhouse rocks. It is young people coming up with concrete and systemic plans to address pressing issues like affordable housing or the lack thereof, sexual assault, gun violence, and bullying in their communities. In my testimony, you see here the fundamental components of Action Civics, so I won't read that to you. They are learning about, like I said, democratic structures and processes by directly engaging with government, calling their elected officials, and proposing legislative, budgetary, policy, or youth advisory decision-making as a concrete way to address the root cause of the problem. We know that, as I said already, that the civic engagement gap especially plagues our most underserved communities, and so communities of color or those where there are fewer resources are 50% less likely to have a civics class in their classroom or have a debate around their dinner table about the role of politics in government. And so through our work here in New York City, but also in 5 other states nationwide, we are trying to address that civic engagement gap and ensure that all Americans get the civic knowledge and skills they need to actively participate in democracy, because we know that that is one of the root causes, in addition to all the structural barriers to participation that we need to address to remedy our current problems. We are the largest Action Civics provider here in New York City. Since founding our site in New York City in 2011, we've educated and empowered over 18,000 students citywide. We are excited by the de Blasio administration's Civics for All initiative through the Equity and Excellence umbrella, and look forward to working with them to think about how to scale and bring Action Civics to all young people citywide. That said, we know that Action Civics in the classroom alone will not strengthen our democracy and bring us back to a healthier place. We know that too much emphasis is placed on voting as the way to be civically engaged, and rather there is a spectrum of civic engagement opportunities that we need to be presenting to young people, but also to adults. And so included with my testimony is our Go Beyond the Ballot toolkit, which includes some common sense ways that we provide to young people, but also adults to be able to stay civically engaged. Thinking about some of those civic pathways beyond the classroom, the city is already doing a great job in that regard, as you heard from the first panel. We support the expansion of participatory budgeting and student voter registration day to ensure that all students citywide can participate. We support the existing youth leadership councils, but think that the city can go a step further to ensure that those are vehicles for students to advocate for systemic policy change and not just awareness raising campaigns. We recommend that the city appoint more young leaders on community boards because under state law, 16 and 17-year-olds can serve, and there are not many of them on local boards. My colleague Andrew Wilkes testified before the commission last week about some of the voting reforms that we'd love to see implemented and for the commission to consider. And given my own work in the structural barriers to participation and my former boss and colleague Wendy Weiser sitting here, I would be remiss if I didn't mention that the commission should consider allowing 16-year-olds to vote and 17-year-olds to vote in municipal elections, thinking about the city's jurisdiction to allow for pre-registration, online registration, and non-citizen voting. One of the things that I want to raise to the commission's attention is this notion of young people, cultivating young people to be the future civic workforce, right? And so we have a summer youth employment program here in New York City, which is very robust, but many of those careers are not in government. And so how do we expect young people to understand how government works if we are not training them to be engaged in government decision-making while sitting at that table? Generation Citizen runs a program where we do place alumni of our programming in government offices and elected officials' offices to do that work, and I would encourage the city to expand that.
1 minute remaining.
Perfect. I'm at my final paragraph. I applaud Councilmember Lander for his vision in proposing the creation of an Office of Civic Engagement. As we all grapple with how to respond to the increased demand for and appreciation of the importance of civic engagement, this is a proposal that merits further consideration. I would note that I'm excited by the mayor's proposal of Democracy NYC, and in particular, the appointment of a chief democracy officer. I would also note that as you consider this proposal, there are many government agencies that already exist that are touching this work, like the Campaign Finance Board, the Community Affairs Union, the Department of Education, the Department of Information Technology and Telecommunications, Department of Youth Community Development, and the Office of Service, among other agencies. And so the commission should consider whether we want to create a new office or think about how to leverage the Chief Democracy Officer to better, integrate all of those offices in their work and thinking about civic engagement citywide. And with that, I thank you for the opportunity to testify.
Thank you. Let us now move on to Ifeoma Ike.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you.
I mispronounced your name, I know. Would you pronounce your name?
Sure. The way my parents would pronounce it,
yes.
Is Ifeoma Ike. Please don't count that against my 5 minutes. But feel free to call me Iffy. So I am here as the principal of Think Rubik's. We are a team that has really been coming together for a while, and in the civic space, our first formal project was Black and Brown People Vote. We were created a week before Mike Brown was killed, and therefore we were on the ground in spaces like Ferguson, Baltimore, and other areas that were grappling with the realities on the ground, and also trying to see civic solutions as a possibility to raise power and voice of the issues that young people were experiencing. We also in 2016 created a space called Black and Engaged. We would have loved for it not to coincide with the election, because part of the space of Black and Engaged was communities outside of quote unquote prime time or every 4-year elections, but to really connect especially skeptical communities with power mapping their way using civic tools to actually create change in their spaces. And most recently, our team developed a successful grassroots campaign called Woke Vote, which was part of the coalition that was successful in the Roy Moore, Doug Jones race in Alabama. So what I really want to center this conversation about is how we equitably engage communities through a culturally relevant lens. While I'm very excited about the creation of another office, I am a former government employee. I was the Deputy Executive Director for the Young Men's Initiative. So what I am nervous about is if we create another government space and it is perceived and seen as another government space by the communities we're trying to serve, if with all the best intentions, if we're actually going to accomplish what we need to accomplish. And I argue that if it's not rooted in equity and cultural relevancy from the beginning, then we may miss the mark. Elections in New York City and New York State as a whole continue to experience a decline in participation, with only 23% of registered voters voting in the 2017 mayoral election, surpassing 2013's record low of 24%. Our city is collectively experiencing a civic depression, which contributes to a lack of diversity severely needed in representation, policy, and thought. Our city has over 5 million registered voters, but what do we really know about these voters? What motivates them? And what about the roughly 800,000 eligible unregistered potential voters? Is it apathy, or is it a collateral consequence of an unforgiving cycle? People get elected, people's lives don't immediately change, people get discouraged, people don't believe in the system. And as a close friend in Alabama simply put it, as I was preparing for today's hearing, quote, "If you in the hood, even if you vote, you still in the hood." As a proud graduate of the hood, I want us to take a moment to understand some things about how the hood can inform your engagement. A 2017 report titled Focus on Poverty by the NYC Women's Center finds that roughly 1.7 million New Yorkers are living in poverty. The report also highlights that not all poverty is equal, that conditions between high poverty rates are starkly different from those of low poverty areas. And to no surprise, poor Black and Latino New Yorkers and poor children are much more likely to live in high poverty neighborhoods, meaning they experience insecurities due to violence, poorer performing schools, and less exposure to adults with college education and employment. While crime is at an all-time low and certain practices like stop and frisk are reportedly protocols of the past, communities of color, and especially Black and brown youth within the city, not only continue to be profiled, but recent reporting highlights that so-called, quote, gang databases have expanded, with increased surveillance resulting in a 70% expansion of juvenile justice-involved persons. And in between gentrifying high-rises and skyscrapers lie neighborhoods coping with generational breakdown in the basics, including shelter and transportation. So according to Maslow's theory of needs, there's virtually no way to get to enduring self-determination at the top of the pyramid if the foundation of basics is mediocre at best. Yet every 4 years and in between for municipal purposes, these same communities are courted into voting or guilted for not participating. And after the outcome sought is achieved, these communities are civically neglected and placed on the shelf until the next electoral season. For many, that is the extent of the relationship that they have with civic engagement. Candidate speeches of change and transformation at best result in the often transactional act of voting, and at worst, a disconnected message fallen flat on already skeptical communities. But we must not dismiss these communities as apathetic. Our city is not an episode of The Walking Dead. Key moments in recent years revealed that the city is extremely engaged and has an active political pulse, from Black Lives Matter to the Women's March to close Rikers, from resisting the Muslim travel ban to advocating against family separation at the border, from Occupy NYC to union strikes. The people of New York City on a regular basis prove that they are willing to miss work, march with their babies, and join aligned strangers in the streets for righteous disruption. They don't need permission to exercise their right to protest, and collectively on many occasions that protest has resulted in change.
1 minute remaining.
The battery pack behind these movements are simply other people. People who know their neighbors' struggles, languages, and histories, people willing to read out loud a brochure for those who are illiterate, visually impaired, or getting their hair and nails done. People willing to organize with other organizers for childcare, bail, and legal support. People willing to urge their fraternity brothers, sorority sisters, and clergy to get engaged. So I offer the following recommendation that aim to embed culture within our charter. If I don't get through all of these, feel free to ask questions and I will submit this at the end. One of which is to incorporate a low-tech component to the voter guides outlined in Chapter 46, Section 1053. Another is to broaden the Voter Assistance Advisory Committee and really look at how we include members of the community, especially as it relates to recommended methods aimed at increasing the rate of voter registration and participation. I'm a strong advocate of early voting and for that to seriously be looked upon as a way to engage communities that are underrepresented. And I do think we should look at maybe including a separate section called civic participation and education, which extends beyond voting for just those who are registered, but we need to start looking at how we look at participation for those that are either undocumented, for individuals that are underage, and for other forms of communities that may not be technically or formally a part of the civic process. I think there are a range of possibilities for the Office of Civic Engagement. I echo colleagues that believe that we can also do these things by integrating spaces that already have civic engagement tools. But one of the things that I think we need to focus on is creating something that at BBPV we call the Future Voters Program, which is to work with young people before they reach voting age and find ways to cultivate a practice of civic, whether through mock debates, mock elections, builds that muscle of civic engagement so that it's not something that's new when they turn 18. At that, I will also yield, but I do want to just end by quickly saying that I do think that part of what also needs to happen is how we look at cultural messaging and really look at the community on the ground, not dismissing their issues, but finding effective spaces for them to be able to talk about their issues that serve as motivation to the community, and for that to be the organic starting point for how they can look at civic engagement as a part of their daily lives, not the other way around. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Ike. With that, let me turn to Susan Duha.
Thank you very much for this opportunity to be heard. I also want to applaud you for holding the hearings in a place that is accessible. I congratulate you for this decision. Based on our 40 years of experience in the disability community and of activism, because we are very much an advocacy organization, we do believe that people with disabilities face enormous barriers to civic participation at absolutely every level. And yet we believe that those barriers can be removed and that civic engagement can be encouraged, including voting. The people with disabilities that we work with at Center for Independence of the Disabled in New York are overwhelmingly living deep in poverty on a long-term basis. The board and the staff of Sydney are majority people with disabilities. I have disabilities. The majority of our staff and of the people we serve are Black, Brown, Asian American, Latina, Latino, Black, and we serve newcomers who do or do not have documented status. And we believe very strongly in inclusion. And we find that people across all disabilities have the same kinds of issues in the public space. We work with individuals not only to reach their individual goals, but to help them understand how they can become empowered and act on the issues that affect them. We rely on having teachers who are people with disabilities help people understand their rights. We teach people their civil rights. People with disabilities teach people with disabilities civil rights. We go into schools, public schools, to work with students with disabilities, to teach them their rights. We also lead efforts to educate people about working with public agencies, about public bodies, about opportunities to become engaged, to provide testimony, to provide assistance in community-based projects that can lead to policy change. We believe that civic engagement has to start where people are and come from the grassroots up. We often are engaged around the things that are most important to people, which are employment. The rate of employment for people with disabilities is 29% in New York City. That should be outrageous to everyone. We have a much higher housing or rent burden than people with no disability. We are more likely to be among the homeless. Some estimates say that as much as 61% of people in homeless shelters are people with disabilities. And it says that that rate is very high because we work with many people who are homeless. We find that transportation is inaccessible. Getting to a public hearing or a public meeting can be fraught with difficulty if you cannot take the subway, because only 18% of the subway is accessible for people with disabilities. Paratransit is a joke. Taxis are not accessible, not that anyone can afford them. These are just a few of the issues. Health facilities are inaccessible. Public schools are inaccessible. And public schools are being used as places to teach civic engagement, theoretically, and to involve people in preparing for adult life. For that matter, police stations in our communities, 2/3 of them are inaccessible to people with disabilities. So if you have been a victim of domestic violence, if you even want to come to a meeting on public safety in the community and talk about your experiences, you may not be able to get in the door. So we teach people about government agencies. We teach people about the courts. We teach people about their rights throughout their lives in every issue or every area that touches them.
1 minute remaining.
We involve people in participating in public bodies. We teach people about how to go out and document civil rights law violations and barriers and create reports that go to public officials. We teach people how to tell their stories to public officials at city hearings. We work with people to be able to be heard, including engaging in civil disobedience. We also engage people in surfacing issues, engaging in issues, finding people who are experiencing difficulties or illegalities, violations of their rights, and we help them become plaintiffs in class action lawsuits to bring about implementation of civil rights law in the city. We have had to have the experience of polling sites not being accessible for people with disabilities. And after submitting surveys done by people with disabilities all across the community on every election day for more than a decade, we were forced to become an expert in litigation against the New York City Board of Elections for failing to make polling sites accessible. That's only the tip of the iceberg. Materials for voters are not available in large print. They're not available in Braille or audio. There are no ASL interpreters at polling sites to assist if things are problematic. These are just a few of the barriers that we engage around that are part of people's lives and where they become engaged in speaking out on their own behalf. We think that building an accessibility to civic engagement efforts is critical. We find retrofitting efforts with accessibility concerns after the fact is a poor way of accomplishing inclusion. We consider that disability literacy training is necessary for people who are working in civic engagement, and we would encourage consideration of people with disabilities as facilitators of projects on civic engagement. We believe in consultation with disability community leaders during early phases and working with disability-led organizations to get the word out. We believe in including people with disabilities in leadership of efforts to signal inclusion. We believe that including issues of concern for people with disabilities on the agenda, such as implementation of civil rights law, is critical.
Can you wrap up, Ms. Duda?
Yes, we believe that public bodies like community boards should define diversity as including disability, as well as other factors. Thank you very much.
Thank you. We're going to move immediately to some questioning. Let me ask the first question. Ms. Getachew, I'm very interested in youth participating in civic engagement. I'm particularly disappointed when I run into young people who don't know the difference between voting in a municipal election and voting for president. You can only reach some percentage of the students through your programs. Do you have any sense, do you believe, first of all, that civics education ought to be required in every school? And do you have any other thoughts about how we might reach the broad base of young people in our city?
Thank you for the correct pronunciation of my last name and for the question. Yes, emphatically believe that we need civics education for all. And I think I'm excited that Mayor de Blasio is prioritizing that and really thinking about a pilot to implement civics for all K-12 interdisciplinary at the start of the 2018-19 school year. We definitely want to partner with him and the Department of Education to do that effectively and make sure that it is action-oriented and not just rote memorization of random government facts. Because in a 21st century democracy, when young people can like and hug and tweet things on the internet, we don't want them to think that memorizing those facts have nothing to do with their real lives. And so that, I think, is the best way to accomplish that, is working within the government system to partner community-based organizations like Generation Citizen and others to be able to help the administration do that effectively, and then ultimately to do that statewide, which is obviously beyond the purview of this commission.
So I want to commend you, Ms. Ike, for what I thought was a very eloquent statement about what to me is the underlying basic problem that this commission is grappling with, which is the profoundly low rate of voter participation across the city. And the fact that if current trends continue, we will have a mayoral election with less than 1 million voters in a city of 8.5+ million people. There's a paradox here, which is that all the things that this city has done over the last 30 years to try to democratize the process, and the tens of millions of dollars that the city spends through, among other things, the matching funds program, we nonetheless have a continuation of the decades-long plunge in voter participation. And I recognize there are many other important forms of civic engagement, but to me, that's the most basic. A long time ago, when I was involved in politics, and on those rare occasions when I actually went out to communities and talked to voters, what I was always struck by was that our grandparents and parents' generations, who had lived through the Depression, who had lived through World War II, who had lived through the Civil Rights era, when you asked them if they voted, they would say, "Of course, I did my duty." There seems to be no sense now of duty, that it's a citizen's obligation to vote. We've never done some of the things that frankly could be done to make it mandatory or to tie other things to voting, but we don't do that in this country. So I guess that's the underlying concern to me on campaign finance, on ballot issues, on civic engagement, et cetera. And what I'd like to ask each of you is, in your opinion or in your experience or based on your work, what is this one single most important thing in your area that this commission could do in terms of revising the charter that might help reverse that plunge in participation and might help restore the sense that voting is actually a duty and an obligation?
So, one thing. So before I say the one thing, I will say that I think there's a difference between what could be done in the charter that has the broadest form of engagement / participation that is not cumbersome. And then there's a separate conversation about duty. And without getting too tortsy, I think there's something about duty that also is a two-way street. So there's a duty from government to the community, right? So as much as it was kind of funny to say, if I vote and I'm still in the hood, then what's the point of voting? The reality is that if we talk about it from an equity standpoint, a lot of people that did participate generations ago, and especially that were veterans, right? The reality is we have a schism between those who participated in the war and then therefore received benefits from the United States that allowed them to see the commitment of being engaged, and then communities largely Black and brown and differently abled that didn't receive the same type of return for their duty. And therefore that generational track also has an impact within communities that have a different understanding about what duty means even after you've served. So that has to, I do think that in addition to engagement education, equity education is important, because it's important to validate the realities that communities are experiencing and not make them seem like they're crazy. It's okay to be like, your reality is actually rooted in history, and these are ways to reverse that. So that's my duty. As far as engagement, I'm sure you all have been very well versed in what some other spaces are doing in the West as it relates to automatic opting in of individuals who are eligible to vote. Also, there is a movement. I mean, I'm very skeptical of absentee ballots for a lot of reasons, but there are movements that do call for individuals to either drop off or to vote at home. National Voter Home Voting Institute, I believe, is one of the organizations that is implementing this in several localities as to how, which kind of speaks to some of the access issues we're talking about, how making voting easy for people to do at home in the privacy of their own home, and then working with the Board of Elections on the back end to make sure that, you know, all the other things that we know don't exist, like voter fraud, but sure, we can look for it if we want to, don't happen. That I think that we actually need to make people feel that voting is your duty, but it doesn't have to be cumbersome, and you don't have to go through extra hoops to do it. So if there was one thing, I would say that if the commission could look at what's the broadest net that we can put out there to get the number, first of all, of registrants to almost close to 100% as possible, and then try to figure out on a culturally relevant basis what then are the biggest swaths of communication, engagement, and I guess, opportunities that exist within the charter. And I think one of the areas that we've mentioned is this advisory board, or this, like, what are the spaces that we can input more people that are just underrepresented? I think if people see more of themselves in spaces that they typically haven't been invited to, that could drastically change how people see the city's commitment and the city's duty to their needs.
To pick up a little bit on what you're saying, people with disabilities feel that they're being made invisible. We want to go out and vote in a public space like our neighbors because we want to be seen. Because our concerns are not even on the radar screen of most public bodies. The thing that I would say is most critical is to ensure that all civic engagement efforts are accessible, that people are included who are people with disabilities, that people with disabilities are visible in civic engagement efforts. And honestly, please make voting accessible. It's terrible to tell people they have a duty to do something you then prevent them from doing. Honestly.
Yeah.
Thank you.
The only, I'm not small, very small thing I would add is just think about, and I think it said this very well, of like the equity lens of civic participation, and how do you digitize and bring it to the 21st century the way that the city is doing all this work that it's already doing, right? So we heard the prior panel talk about all of the agencies that have a hand in civic participation. We know that it's not integrated, not for lack of effort or not for lack of priority, just it's a big bureaucracy. How do we make sure they're doing that work in a 21st century way and meeting communities where they are to engage them on the issues they care about? Because we've all become much more, for better word, lack of a better word, selfish, right? We care about issues and we want to figure out how we can solve those issues. Let's meet the New Yorkers where they are.
I would ditto everything that everybody said on this panel, and I would just add same-day voting, I think, would alleviate a lot of barriers, as well as employer buy-in, time off to show that you have voted and have buy-in there.
So thank you for these really tremendous contributions, and it's really nice to see you all here. And I fully support the effort to expand voting accessibility and participation. I wanted to ask the related question. I think all of you in some ways have talked about that civic engagement depends on meeting communities where they are. And I was hoping, in addition to thinking about how to expand voting access, what might be the kinds of forums that would exist that would give people a better perception that the government is responsive to them and they have access to get their issues on the table, and that would feel like it's sort of cutting through some of the obstacles that are there, and might some of the proposals that are already on the table be able to be used to accomplish some of what all of you have suggested is an important barrier.
Housing.
This is for everybody.
People with disabilities are overwhelmingly living in poverty on a long-term basis. Poverty is an immense issue. Talking about how to address poverty is critical. It is essential to address housing for extremely low-income people. Housing for people with moderate incomes is just not cutting it for people who are on SSI level income, and certainly not for others also on forms of public assistance. It is absolutely essential that our transportation system be made a system for everyone, because lack of transportation impedes employment, and not serving communities with the transportation that they need cuts people out of the community. Similarly, healthcare that is accessible, being able to go around and everywhere you encounter is inclusive, is accessible, and cares about the concerns that you're bringing in.
I would say, speaking specifically from the youth lens, making sure we're setting those habits early, that it is not reactive. So in Generation Citizen classrooms, we encourage our students to call their elected officials during class time, to invite influencers and elected officials into the classroom and actually have that time to engage directly with the decision makers, so that it doesn't feel reactive, right? So that they are actually leading policy change and it's meeting them where they are in the classroom. Think about, like I said, civic workforce cultivation opportunities and exposure early in this pipeline, so that they understand that government is relevant and accessible to them, and make sure that it's led by the constituents you're trying to, or the stakeholders you're trying to engage.
Yeah, I would say that first, it would be interesting to hear a little bit more as this develops as to the level of independence you all feel this office could hold. While I do think we have spaces and agencies that have this information, part of, I think, what's difficult, and we've all somewhat been there, is that all governments, not just New York City, are uncomfortable holding forums, to use your word, that could potentially open up the door to hearing things that they don't want to hear. Or maybe I just made that up. So one of the things that I think we should think about is, what are the independent spaces that allow people to feel like there's some type of ownership over what they're doing, right? So one of the things that I will, I guess, share with you all that I didn't have time to talk about in my 5 minutes was this concept of like a civic core, right? Something that happens throughout the year that allows for people from the community, however they identify themselves, to speak to other people that identify with them, to allow for a continuous loop, if you will, of just conversation with communities that's just outside of just the election process. Something that just allows for feedback, but also something that's not a forum created by, or even the responsibility of just the mayor or city council, that allows people to feel free to share both their frustrations, but also their problem-solving solutions, and that it's valued, and not just for kabuki theater, like actually valued, and that there's a way we can formalize those concerns to whatever entity or body that we have. So I do think that the forums would have to be created, and I think that that's actually a space that communities would be extremely excited about. And to even the point about language and what have you, it allows people to express the way that they need to express, and not necessarily have to be politically correct or judged for how they are communicating.
And to underscore that, I think it's really important that, meetings be systematized, not just once in a blue moon. Too many of our immigrant communities don't even know who their contact or community affairs person is in the police department. And so regularized, institutionalized means in safe spaces and in cultural settings that people really mean it. And the use of simultaneous translation equipment to go through that effort to make sure that people's views, no matter what language they speak, are important. And then lastly, I think it's really critical for the city to engage in active highlighting of immigrant contributions to the city. There's too much divisiveness between different groups, and to highlight how immigrant communities have helped mainstream America and other groups with issues that are of common concern to them would go a long way.
My thanks to all of you. It's been very helpful, and we will certainly be considering your thoughts as we do our work. Thank you.
Thank you.
We've got our next panel. No, City Council.
No, I'm here. You're going up first.
We've temporarily lost a couple of commissioners, but I'm sure they'll be here in a moment. But I'm anxious to hear what you have to say. So we will commence, and you will forgive the commissioners who will walk in a minute or two. This panel deals with new tools and models for civic engagement. We've heard already from what the city is already doing. We just had a panel who shared their thoughts as to what we ought to be thinking about doing in the future. I want to talk to these two gentlemen about how we do that. That's very important to us. The two members of this panel are Noel Hidalgo, the Executive Director of the NYC. I understand you have some slides.
No.
You don't have slides.
No.
That's all right. I forgive you.
I wish I could have Brad's slides go in front because it would contextualize everything.
All right.
But, I'm happy to go in front without slides.
But Councilman Lander, you may have slides.
I have slides.
All right. It'll be the first slides of the morning or afternoon by now. I am prepared to begin. Let's begin with Noel Hidalgo.
Thank you. It's an honor to be in front of you, and it's an honor to come back and be considered an expert in technology and tools and civic engagement. I'm just going to be off the cuff, and thank goodness there's someone who's going to be taking transcription. I'm really have to commend everyone who has presented beforehand. The issues that they brought up that I've seen are building trust in government. Particularly this last panel ended with the idea of some type of civic core. And then also speaking about how do you get people aware of public information, and ultimately how do people feel that they have a voice and traction within government proceedings. And so how do they find a particular problem, and then how do they address it? And in my first testimony in front of this panel, I focused on that there are three particular issues. The first one is that government should be digital because it provides the greatest amount of flexibility and accessibility across languages and platforms and devices. Digital and data literacy are core elements of a 21st century democracy. And then ultimately, we need civic participation beyond the ballot box. There have been a number of charter revision commissions that have attempted to address these things. The first one is COPIC. So there's actually a provision right now that sits under the Public Advocate's Office that allows for this Commission on Public Information and Communication. And in 1989, this was a very virtuous commission, but sadly, near 30 years after its creation, resources have been scarce. This particular commission has hardly even met its charter mandated requirements once per year. It's no longer even advocated on the Public Advocate's website, and technology has kind of outstripped many of the components within COPIC. The city's open data law is an excellent example of that. COPIC was designed to essentially document all of the city's open data, and now we actually have legislation that sits around that. And so there are a few core elements within what I would like to see as recommendations for moving forward. The first is that there's this thing called civic service design or service design, which speaks to many of the issues that previous panelists were talking about. And I have a pamphlet here, which is actually from NYC Opportunity on tools and tactics. And it's essentially how do we build government services with people, not for people. This is the very first mayoral office that's dedicated to thinking about how services are designed in a co-design process. This is policy, websites, tools, documents, all of these things are co-designed through a practice. We're pioneering it here in New York City, and this is one of those particular tools that I think is fundamental that should be part of the Office of Civic Engagement. The second thing is that content on municipal websites is absolutely at its core. It is how we find out what is going on within our municipal government. And we continue to underfund and under-resource that at the community board level. We are at a point where community board websites are using content management systems that are 20 years old, that are very clunky. My organization, Beta NYC, is trying to get the city to adopt more open source tools that are secure and flexible, so that way we can have technology, 21st century technology, in the 21st century, and we're not using 20th century technology in the 21st century. Second to that, there is an excellent department inside of New York City Planning. It's called NYC Planning Labs, and with a core team of 4 people, they've been able to redesign 8 urban planning tools using open source practices. This is a way how agencies can be working efficiently, securely, and in the open. Lastly, we fundamentally believe that New Yorkers need a central touch point of how they can engage within their municipal government. And while NYC 311 has a great service, NYC Service does a great service, we want to figure out how do we petition government in a 21st century manner that essentially points out that there is a bug within our operating system and that we want the operating system improved. And to that point, several years ago, we wrote for and called for a We the People of New York City, which is essentially a petitioning tool that would allow New Yorkers to identify a particular problem that's in the city and work with their neighbors to get that articulated, and kind of figure out what is the traction and what's the process to identify these problems, work with their neighbors to express that this problem exists, and then figure out resources within that. Participatory budgeting has done a great job of building out that as a scaffolding and as a framework to address those particular issues, but participatory budgeting really only focuses on capital projects, not necessarily discretionary projects.
1 minute remaining.
Thank you. So what we're looking for, at least within the Office of Civic Engagement, we feel that the Office of Civic Engagement actually can be a digital steward that focuses on this amazing thing that exists in Taiwan, where they have participation officers, and these individuals help foster online, offline best practices to essentially identify these very particular sour points or bugs within our ecosystem or our software system. We want to see participatory budgeting grow to be actually 1% of the discretionary and capital budget, so that way our our people are actually determining what are the problems that need to be fixed. There's actually money behind that. And ultimately, we want to see a civic service studio and technology lab that's based right now in NYC Opportunity grow their practice so that way they can help all government agencies and nonprofit services that are providing essential services to New Yorkers, as well as community groups, figure out how to address all of the issues that are cross-generational, cross communities that to ensure that there is systems and policy and design and technology that all work in conjunction with each other. Thank you.
Thank you. We're going to hold our questions till after we hear from Councilman Lander, but just be prepared to answer my question, which is, how do folks who are not particularly literate in our technology take advantage of all that you're talking about? But don't answer it now. Mr. Councilman, you got the floor.
Much, Chair Perales and members of the commission. It's good to see you again. I was grateful for the opportunity to come testify before you in Brooklyn on a broader set of matters, and I've been following your work since then. And especially, as you know, I'm a strong supporter of instant runoff or ranked choice voting, and I watched the hearing that you had on that. I thought your questions were good. I remain a big believer that that will help strengthen our elections and our democracy. But today, I'm here to talk to you about especially two tools for strengthening civic engagement in New York City: the establishment of an independent, nonpartisan Office of Civic Engagement, and to make participatory budgeting part of the New York City Charter and would be operated out of the Office of Civic Engagement. You've focused on these things, so I won't go long on these issues, but as you know, we're really facing a crisis in our democracy in New York City with just, extremely low levels of turnout in the elections that matter, and voters wondering why it is they would want to participate. But it's not only an issue of, obviously not only an issue of our low voting rate is part of this broader issue of a decline in civic trust in all our institutions, in government especially, but across the board. People just don't think of reaching out to government as a way of getting issues resolved, even where those issues are government issues. And in addition, we really have, even though some extraordinary examples of volunteerism and civic service, very low levels of people actually participating in that way. As I mentioned, this exists across the board. We've really seen, I'm going to go to the next slide actually, because it has the decline numbers. We've just seen a trust crash. You can see that government, the third column, has the biggest decline from even just year to year, 2017 to 18, a 30-point drop in the informed public in trusting government. But it's also true across our nonprofit organizations, business, and the media. That's much broader than New York City, of course, and even broader than the US. It's the whole planet. But we try to take a lead here and say, what are the things we could be doing to confront this decline in civic trust? So that's why we're here today, is what things could we be doing, not only that'll increase the voter turnout, though surely that is important, but that will strengthen people's belief that the idea of democracy as a space to come together with their neighbors, to solve problems, take care of our common institutions, and move us forward in a sense of broad opportunity is real. And participation is one of those key goals. It's not the only one. I included this slide because obviously transparency and accountability are critical if people are going to have trust in government. So thinking about efficiency and transparency is critical, but more participation in places that go beyond just voting and jury duty, that people associate with government, is really critical. And of course, we actually have a lot of that already. People are engaged in their PTAs, in Friends of their Parks and Parks Conservancies, in Friends of their Libraries, and organizations advocating to make our streets safer. There are all these places where people have what the social scientists are calling thick engagement, not just showing up one time to, paint an affordable housing unit, though that is great, but in these deeper ways that are about being stewards together of our common realm. And I'm not going to kind of go through all of these, but the examples, and you heard some of this on your prior panel, of places where people are active, again, in spaces that are really partnerships between civic or nonprofit organizations and government, in deep ways, whether that's, creating the new library reading garden at the neighborhood library branch through participatory budgeting, whether that's through some of these extraordinary immigrant organizations that are doing programming in their plazas and their senior centers and their community centers, and not only making their neighborhoods sort of work better, but building out a sense of kind of who they are and their stories and their community with both offline tools and online tools. It really is something that we want to do both of. So I can, in response to questions, talk more about this idea of thick engagement, but we found it in the literature to be, how do you go beyond the voting lever and the jury duty to a sense of yourself as a citizen that's got a set of responsibilities and opportunities that is more deeply about who you are and who your neighbors are. So that's how we came to this idea. How could we create a space to organize that work? It'll be a lot of different things, but we need somewhere in government that has that responsibility to deepen and strengthen New Yorkers' sense of civic duty, to build trust in our institutions, to try out new programs, some of which will work and some of which don't work. Two ideas we have so far are that Civic Corps, some kind of year-long civic service that people would either have a responsibility or an opportunity to do, and broader participatory budgeting. But there's many other places as well, helping New Yorkers in existing spaces like community boards and all those friends groups I mentioned build and develop their leadership skills. We believe all could happen under the idea of this office. So so as I mentioned, I introduced legislation last year that would create the office, but for reasons I'll get to in just a minute, it would actually be better to do in the charter, so it could be done in an independent, nonpartisan way, which we can't just do by local law. Coming off the legislation, we convened a great roundtable with some of the organizations that were on the panel that you just had, but a whole bunch of others as well. And one thing that is really critical here is there are all these groups, of course, doing good civic engagement work as civic or nonprofit organizations, and we want to make sure they can be partners in this effort. You can't just do this through government institutions, but you can't just do it through nonprofits either. If the goal is to organize people in different ways and strengthen their connection to and capacity to make change in government, we've got to do it in a partnership. I would get better at pushing the button between the slides, but I have not been able to do that. There we go. So what would the office do? It would strengthen collaborations between existing city programs, of which you already heard several. You've got the Voter Assistance Commission, you've got NYC Service, you've got the Community Affairs Unit, you've got community boards, you've got all those friends groups. There's nobody that works to kind of coordinate, network, and organize them. There'll be all kinds of new programs it could develop. We're seeing, we just saw this great new student voter registration day, so some innovation is happening, but having a team dedicated to coming up with new ideas could do more things, like the idea of a civic service year, or as I'll speak more to in just a second, expanding participatory budgeting. And I mentioned all these places where people act as stewards that I think escape notice. But if you add up the Parks Friends Group, the Library Friends Groups, the Plaza organizations, those are all public government-owned spaces that New Yorkers are actually programming, filling up, fundraising for, taking care of. And I don't think we see those as deeply connected to taking care of and having a healthy democracy in ways that we might. As Noel mentioned, helping people just find all of those things, get to the information about how to participate. Another real opportunity here. Providing uniform support, training, and technical assistance. I know you've been thinking about community boards, and certainly some of that happens through the Community Assistance Unit, but this could be a place that developed a set of leadership training that helped folks across those different kinds of organizations to build the skills they need for leadership in civic space, to mobilize new technology tools, and of course to track and evaluate all of this. We have to see, are we actually, if we take these steps, strengthening civic trust? Are more people participating? Are more people voting? So we want to have real good evaluation as well. Sorry for the formatting. On this question of how it should be structured, we have to think about three kind of different options. And one of them, for two of them for sure, would take a charter revision commission proposal. One could theoretically be done by local law. What we could do is direct the administration to establish a mayoral office. That would have some benefits because networking and coordinating with mayoral agencies would be easier, but would have some downsides as well because any mayor is going to have their own agenda. And if they've got an organizing shop, then that person, any elected official, would most likely use it to advance the goals that they already have, as opposed to create a space where people can organize based on their own goals. So that's the main risk of having it be a mayoral agency. A second option would be there already is, as you know, NYC Votes housed at the Campaign Finance Board with an independent, nonpartisan board. And that would have some advantages because you could connect to NYC Votes. It would be independent and nonpartisan. The downside there is that the critical regulatory function of the Campaign Finance Board is different from the more social entrepreneurial function that we're imagining in this office. So you'd have some positives there, but some downsides as well. The third option would be to create a new entity with an appointed nonpartisan board. I think it would be best in that case if NYC Votes went there, because if the goal is to strengthen voter participation and link that to the set of activities that we talked about here, you get a new nonpartisan independent board. They coordinate all of this work and are really focused on that as their mission. That has some downsides for sure. You got to create a new entity instead of build on the solid structure that the CFB already has put in place. And in both of the two latter cases, harder to get coordination with mayoral agencies who report to the mayor. So those are the three options. I'm happy to talk more about which ones seem to make most sense. I lean to this third one, but I think there's good arguments for the others as well. In any case, we want to make sure it can be independent and nonpartisan so that the goal of helping people organize to do the things they want to do and not the things we want them to do is critical. It needs an advisory board of those civic and nonprofit organizations who are doing so much of the civic engagement work in the city. It needs dedicated resources, of course, outside of the annual allocating process so that it can't be punished for activities that people do who engage in organizing by an angry city council or an angry mayor. And the goal is not to reinvent the wheel, but to network and streamline and new programs. So that's the idea. In the final minute, talk specifically about participatory budgeting, which would be a great program to have under this Office of Civic Engagement. But I think it's worth thinking about you putting a specific ballot proposal on as well. I think this idea that 1% of the capital budget and perhaps a dedicated percent of the expense budget as well would be spent through participatory budgeting is a really exciting opportunity to deepen civic engagement. I know it sounds a little crazy. It sounded crazy when we started participatory budgeting 7 years ago at all, but it's happening now in Paris, in Madrid, in other cities around the world and around the US, where they have a centralized participatory budgeting program organized through either an office like this or the mayor's office. It's a small percentage of the budget, but the difference it makes in waking people up to thinking about how we make budget decisions together is really profound. We started 7 years ago in the city council with just 4 of us trying this out. And that year, 8,000 New Yorkers voted. Last year, it was done in more than half the council districts citywide. Over 100,000 people participated and they spent over $41 million. It's now expanding into our high schools as a result of a program proposed by the mayor. And what we have just found time and again is that it really brings out people's both most creative and most generous democratic selves. Of course, some people show up and say, fix my playground or fix my kid's public school. But they also show up and say, hey, that stitch of grass in the library, that could be a new children's reading garden and a whole new creative space is created. Or one of the things I'm most proud of in my district last year, the winning project was a mobile shower unit proposed by the local soup kitchen that wanted its patrons to have an opportunity to shower and get some dignity It went on the ballot and it got the most votes of any project in my district has ever had. So that says at least sometimes under the right conditions, the opportunity to lean forward and participate together can bring out, instead of our most tribal angry selves, as we're seeing so often these days, our most generous selves, our most democratic selves. And we've really seen that. So I think here the idea is that you could put a proposal on the ballot to establish participatory budgeting as 1% of the city's capital and expense budgets and move it forward through the Office of Civic Engagement. The last thing, so I'm done with my testimony, and I don't know if you have, is this
good?
Okay. But is this like a 2 or 3 minute video? If you have time and questions and you ask the question, are there out there around the world some innovative new technology tools through which people are engaging?
Well, we're going to give you a chance to do the video because I'm now curious. But so it's not fair to throw out this question to Noel a moment ago and then not come back to it. But it's also, I think, relates to your suggestion. We had a panel representing, in essence, different groups, whether it be immigrants or others, but the disabled. In terms of civic engagement, one of the groups that I don't think New York City taps well are the retired folks. Although I know there is an agency that's supposed to be working with them, but you know, many of them are basically technologically illiterate. How would you address them, Mr. Hidalgo?
So my organization works with the Manhattan Borough President's Office to get community boards digitally literate. And as you have probably engaged with community boards, they span the gamut of literacy. My mom's in her 70s is a very savvy Facebook user, but trying to get her to use some of the dashboards that we're creating may be a little bit of a stretch. So how do we go about it? I mean, it's the same way that you go about building any other type of literacy. It is a concentrated effort. You have to be able to link the tool that you're using, right, pen and paper, with the process or the purpose of what is it good for, taking notes. Well, these dashboards that we're creating visualizes 311 data and then links that to a decision-making process within the community board. So you always have to contextualize information, contextualize the tool and the purpose and the result that you're looking for. It's not easy because, you know, these tools advance. They sometimes are done in ways that are complicated, or they were designed years ago and then forgotten and never to be updated again. Our city's rules website happens to be one of those things where you can actually comment on the city's rules, but you can't actually access that rules website through your mobile phone. You can't access it decently on a tablet. You can really only access it on one of these big machines. The same thing goes for community board websites. Majority of them are accessible only on desktops. They're not accessible on your mobile phones. They're not accessible on tablets. So the idea is, how do we get technology working for everyone, is by bringing them into the room, engaging with them on the platforms that they have either in their pockets or in their bags, understanding that those interfaces need to be rewritten for the users that are out there, and having direct dialogue with them. That is what civic service design is about. That's what human-centered design is about. That's what the work that we're trying to do at Beta NYC is about. That's what we want to see embedded in government. Human-centered government. Right now, we have this process where essentially we're electing officials to represent us, but yet when issues come up that we want to be represented, it is hard-pressed to find them to represent us. That's what the last two panelists were talking about. And in this particular process, I'd like to point out what Taiwan does. And Taiwan has a multi-platform petitioning process. It is paper and it is digital. And you have the ability to bring up issues. If you write in a paper petition, that would be digitized and put online so that everybody else can see it. Everybody who's on the website can see these petitions. Once it crosses a certain threshold, there is a government body, hopefully the Office of Civic Engagement in the future here in New York City, that would be chartered to either figure out, is it a participatory budgeting issue? Is it a financial issue, like doors on bathrooms in the elementary school that I live across the street from? Or is it a systematic policy issue, like how Uber should exist within New York City, or how for hire vehicles should be regulated in the future? If it is part of this regulatory process, the V-Taiwan process identifies the stakeholders, public, academic, and government, brings them into the room, and then goes through a multi-iterative process to identify what are those issues. So to answer your question, how do you get people using modern technology? Well, you have to use the human-centered design approach. You actually have to bring those people into the room. And thank goodness we have entities in New York City like NYC Opportunity, like NYC Planning Labs, that understand that they're building technology with their users and not for their users.
Do you have any response to the idea that I'm concerned about reaching everybody and bringing everybody into volunteerism and civic engagement, including folks that are retired and sitting home figuring out what to do next?
Absolutely. We have a wonderful organization in my neighborhood called Good Neighbors of Park Slope, which is designed to do exactly this. It's not a service organization for seniors. It's a civic organization for seniors, and I've been very encouraged by what they do. First, obviously, all the opportunities that we provide need to be both online and offline. In participatory budgeting, you can give an idea at a neighborhood assembly in person, or you can go online and give an idea. They're all equal. You can vote online, or you can vote in person. And then you have to do it in enough language, in the languages that people speak, and go get out there in the ways that they, where they are. I will say, in terms of bringing people further along than you might think, we're working with two organizations, Older Adult Technology Services and a Bengali language South Asian group, so that next week there's going to be a graduation. Actually, it's in the computer lab that's in the basement of a New York City homeless shelter. They've got this great computer lab, and a group of Bangladeshi senior citizens have gone through a 10-week training class in technology. And the reports I've gotten, I'm going to go join them for the graduation, are that not only have they learned tech, but in many ways, what they've done more than anything else is build community. It's people who were kind of in their homes otherwise. So I think with some creativity, there are some great opportunities to do what you're talking about.
Do you have a question, John? All right.
I have two questions for Councilman Lander. When you read the city charter, what you see is obviously a large and far-flung government, but a real tendency to try to solve identified problems by creating offices within the office of the mayor on substantive areas or interagency coordination, a vital thing. They never go away. Mayors often don't care about them. First deputy mayors in particular never like them. And I'm worried that if we do this, that will happen. I didn't really see on your con list of doing a mayoral office that it will atrophy and be in a back office at 5152 Chamber, 250 Broadway. But you create it and it never goes away. So how do you respond to that?
Yeah, I think you're right. And I'll sort of say guilty as charged. Some of those offices are created because a particular mayor is, interested in a problem, creates a new agency, actually invests in it, but then the next mayor is trying to do something else and so doesn't continue to do that. Or an office gets created through law because the council is interested in an issue and pushes something forward. I'll give an interesting example. We wanted to get universal access to counsel for low-income tenants facing eviction in housing court, a right to counsel. And we couldn't quite win that at first. So we thought, you know what, we'll create an office of civil justice, and they'll be charged with looking at this question. And then we do have universal access, but we also still have this office. And you're right, I think for now it's got a good person and some mayoral support. Who knows what will happen in the next term? So I think you're right here, which is why I think the best proposal is to stand something up that's more independent and that has dedicated resources. So you're getting someone as the leader who signs on for that mission, It has the other downsides that then it's harder to coordinate with the mayoral agencies, but in this case, I think.
Second question, it's not really a question, it's really a comment, and it's not meant as criticism of your work, but you're the guy sitting here. I'm disappointed in something with this whole forum today. We're talking about civic engagement, we're talking about volunteerism. There's been not one mention of the extensive civic engagement and volunteerism work done throughout the private sector in New York City. There appears to be a large disconnect between the way this issue is being talked about and where much of this work is being done. I certainly know in my own industry, the amount of civic engagement, volunteerism, and contribution by law firms in the city, including supporting all of the nonprofits with legal services that are here advocating for civic engagement. And there just seems to be a disconnect. I can't imagine we're going to create an advisory board on an Office of Civic Engagement without mandating private sector participation, for example, or in your roster of the community planning things going on, there's no mention of the business improvement districts, which are and have been one of the most vital community planning vehicles. So I just raised that I think we need to think about that and integrate the public and private sector to a degree that seems to be missing in this discussion.
I think you're right. I will point out, I have it on the slide here, even though I didn't talk about it, that partnering with employers. No, it's a good point. I didn't say it. And I think on not including bids in that list of friends groups and PTAs, absolutely, that's another place where folks who are volunteers, they have a financial stake in the commercial strip, but they're still volunteers as members of those boards and putting in time to act as stewards of public space in a public-private partnership. So I absolutely agree that they're in that stewardship list. And then, yes, I think partnering with the enormous amount of civic and volunteer energy in the private sector is an important role of the office.
Can I just add real quickly to Commissioner Siegel? The point of the V-Taiwan process is once you have identified a problem, you actually use this multi-stakeholder engagement that includes government, academics, private sector, as well as nonprofit organizations. And so one of our recommendations is that this Office of Civic Engagement have these participation officers that are able to bring in this diversity, these 4 particular channels to address those particular problems. So I would love to see business.
Yeah, I mean, in the tech sector more than anywhere, that's critical, both because they have the ability to do it. And, you know, you see this situation like in Seattle with Amazon and this tax proposal, that when you get these disconnects between the public sector and the private sector, all sorts of negative consequences occur. So.
On tech, I heard a wonderful podcast recently with a woman whose name I'm going to forget, who was a leader first on immigration in the Obama White House and is now at maybe New America Foundation, working to create kind of the equivalent in the tech sector of what exists in the legal community, a strong pro bono network, and try to get folks in the tech sector who are available to provide some of the same kinds of pro bono assistance to civic and nonprofit. I'll get her name in the podcast.
Yeah. Lisa Mastromonaco.
I think we have to look at the broad spectrum of what it is we're trying to do. And in talking about civic engagement, I know last night I was in Bay Ridge with the youth for a youth forum, although I was probably the only commissioner there, but it was good to engage the young people after their basketball game. And just start, as the educator in me came out, you know, I'm a teacher, so I was glad to talk to the young people. And they came up with some very, very interesting ideas, but when we first started, they had no idea that as young people, they had any effect on anything. They were able to give us all of what they thought was miseducation in the high school where they go, that there was not labs for them, and that they thought that many of them were given up on, so they were just in school for being in school's sake. And then talking about brain power, being able to analyze and understand their own development, and that's where I come in. I think that we've missed the chance to educate our young people what their role and their responsibility in the society is. We can't keep bashing elected officials and think that the larger society won't feel that we're all no good if we're politicians and that we're not for the public good. So we have to look at the way in which we send the message out and what we receive in return. Because somebody will say, so why should I go out and vote for that Una Clark? Because she's not going to do whatever it is I'm going to be voting for. So we have to make sure that people understand the importance of the vote and the power of the vote. And I think it begins, I think, in my mind, we should talk about our role in society so that young people understand that they have a role to play, and that role, that voting is probably going to be one of those roles that they have to play. I think both in junior high school as well as in high school, first year, young people, we need to put back in the curriculum in some way where young people have a sense of pride, have a sense of ownership, so that when they get to be of the age where they vote, that they know that that's a responsibility. Do you have, in your research, have you done anything that would link our youth to their development and then into the full civic engagement?
Absolutely. First, I will say, you know, it's such an inspiring time on the level of young people stepping up and taking more responsibility for things mostly that we have screwed up. So I've been inspired by watching junior high and high school students, especially around gun violence, but so many other issues as well. We, through participatory budgeting, have engaged young people. There's both the school-based programs that are now starting, but also we allow middle and high school students to propose ideas, be budget delegates, and vote in participatory budgeting. And the projects that young people propose have won in many cases. And what I think that the evidence shows is when you can combine civics education with something that actually shows people the ability to make a change or make a difference, it works much more effectively than just, like with everything else, just textbook education. So participatory budgeting is a great way of doing that. You put it within a broader civics education curriculum, and not every decision gets made that way, but some do, and people get a real sense of how they can make a difference. There's other programs like that that involve people, young people in philanthropy, but where they're doing as well as learning. And the last thing I'll say about the role of participatory budgeting to get at some of these issues of helping understand what government really is. One thing I love about it is that the budget delegates have to engage with the bureaucracy. And so you don't just get to say, I want this new park, I want the bathrooms fixed up, I want air conditioning in our schools. You then have to go engage with the agencies, understand how much it would cost, why it's a challenge. And people really, for the most part, some people get angry and say, I'm sick of this, I'm walking away, I can't do it, I'm so mad. More often they say, all right, I see why it's harder to do this thing than I thought it would. We're going to have to work harder and get more people involved. And so at least some of that cynicism that I think can grow otherwise gets countered.
Whoa, I thought there were more questions. I will say that we have actually a civic technology and open data curriculum that we partnered with CUNY undergraduates that we now give to community board members, and we're looking to do that with high school and middle school students. And so the idea is partnering government information and problems that community members express and pointing out that students have an opportunity to use that information as power to then lobby government to address those particular issues. And I hope that this type of curriculum would be embodied within the Office of Civic Engagement.
It's quick, and I think the answer will be quick. So my questions for member Lander. Sorry, regarding your participatory budgeting proposal, would you recommend that we require all council districts and all council members to participate? Because right now they're
Yes, I mean,
they have
I
a
would
choice.
say it would be if it was done by the Charter Revision Commission, it would be a citywide program. And whether it would be done, whether the local, in Paris, there's citywide projects and local projects. Whether the local projects are done through the community districts or through the council districts, you'd have to decide. I don't think it matters that much one way or the other. But yes, it would be a citywide program for all New Yorkers rather than at the discretion of individual council.
And then really quickly, my second question is, I think I've been convinced about your proposal around the Office of Civic Engagement. The one piece that's missing for me, and I asked a similar question of the previous panel, is what needs to happen on the ground to ensure its success? I think John hinted at a sentiment of creating another office that is potentially a bureaucracy that's disconnected or not able to even truly be successful because nothing's really changed in terms of the infrastructure in neighborhoods and in communities. And we know that also the infrastructure in neighborhoods is uneven depending where you are in the city. So, yeah, thanks.
Yeah, it's hard to guarantee success. I think the elements needed are a good board, a set of people who are appointed in a way that gives them independence and collectively sort of sets them apart, so that they're hiring a director or a leader who is a person that could really do that job and is excited about it. Enough resources dedicated to make sure that they can hire the outreach workers and the language capacity and the tech capacity that they need. And an advisory structure that brings the partners into the design as well. And that definitely includes business, but also many of the organizations you had here who are doing that work, and especially who are doing it in more disenfranchised communities, so that folks are really tied and bought in. And I think that set of people together would be very likely to design a set of programs that were inspirational.
The transcriptionist needs a break, as do the commissioners, but this will give us a chance to watch our movie or something.
Great.
Thank you both very, very much. We appreciate it.
This is, so the city of Madrid developed an open source software tool called Consul, which is being used all around the world to facilitate different kinds of participation in government.
Participate in the decisions that affect our lives is not only necessary, but also very effective. It is proven that in places where citizens participate in decision-making, everyday problems are solved more efficiently. The free and open source Consul software, developed by the City of Madrid, is a powerful tool for citizen participation, allowing the inhabitants of the municipalities and regions to participate directly in public decision-making. It is an initiative of collaboration between cities, a network of shared knowledge that continues to grow, having already been successfully added to dozens of municipalities, not only in Spain, but throughout the world.
Nosotros lanzamos este programa de Buenos Aires Elige. Estamos particularmente orgullosos porque en un mes, en la etapa de presentación de propuestas, ideas y proyectos, 25,000 personas dejaron sus ideas.
The citizens put forward their proposals, and those that receive sufficient support pass to the voting stage, so that all can decide on whether it should go ahead.
De llevar una propuesta ciudadana a la realidad es muy sencilla. Es que el gobierno se sienta vinculado con esa decisión y que la lleve a cabo. ¿Cómo la lleva a cabo? Pues en la Junta de Gobierno se decide llevar a pleno las medidas que sean oportunas y votar a favor en el pleno.
Better parks, more green spaces, meeting places for young people. Citizens wish to create a better surrounding. Hence, all the proposals are logical, sustainable, and social.
Con un nuevo equipo de rugby podríamos ampliar el número de jugadoras y jugadoras.
Queremos un espacio en Distrito Centro para pequeños, bebés y grandes.
Y la creación de un parque con una megaestructura de juego para que sea el punto de reunión de todos los niños del distrito.
The tool can be translated into different languages, can easily be configured and adapted in terms of its image and style. Once the government backs Consul, only two things are needed: a server based on Unix and a programmer. We will help you with everything else.
Un gobierno nos dice que quiere utilizar Consul, les invitamos a un sistema de chat muy moderno, muy bonito que se llama Slack, y allí hablamos con estas 100 personas que están usando Consul, estamos resolviendo dudas, nos piden funcionalidades.
Transparency, efficiency, and collaboration are the words that best describe Consul. Because with everybody's help, we can build better cities.
You can use a lot lot of cities use this as their platform for participatory budgeting. So you do it through this open source software. But then there are also places that use it either for a kind of citizens can petition with a legislative or a regulatory idea. In Madrid, the councils even agreed that if a thing gets nominated by enough people and then voted on by enough people, they'll make it law online. And well, offline too, they do paper ballots also, but yes, they have thresholds, but you can use it that way. Thank you.
Thank you. Good to see you. You were on last week. Oh, good. Right. You guys were on the first. Yeah.
Back and forth. So. But it's good. I think you guys.
Okay. Thank you. All right. I'll see you there.
I don't know, probably have our own copies. It's already on the website.
Rolling there.
Oh, that's good. All right, let me just say hello to these guys real quick. All right.
Yeah. Next and last. So almost that. Pushing this notion. Pushing this notion. There are facts out there that happen.
John? Yes. Who else is it? Who? Who's the other guy?
I do have a hard copy too.
Thank you again.
Triple my salary and I'm still. I'm in your district.
Wondering, I was like, how did that fly out? I was like excited to see her, but.
Good to see you.
Hmm? Yeah. Oh, yeah, I know. That they cover, sure, that's one of their areas they work in. Sure. No. Is that? What's her name? She's gonna pipe in her testimony? Oh, okay. Oh, okay. Yes. What is it, 5 minutes or 7? You're giving them? Okay. All right. Thank you. Hi. Is she with Common Cause? The chair said she's with. That's, yeah, I believe that's her.
We are running a little late. We're going to have to begin so that I'll ask everyone to take their seat, including commission members. Wendy? We're now going to our last panel. This panel is devoted to the question of independent districting and whether or not we ought to amend the New York City system for redistricting, a redistricting scheme that is embodied in our city charter and which is actually the result of an earlier city charter commission. This is the first time we're going to have a panelist by the name of Kathy Fung, who's the Executive Director of California Common Cause and the National Redistricting Director. First time we have somebody on Skype. Can you hear me, Kathy?
We can hear you.
Very good. Okay. In person, we have Dr. John Flatteau, a professor at Medgar Evers College, and our own local expert on redistricting, who gets invited to sit on every redistricting commission every few years. So he may look young, but he's been on redistricting commissions since my childhood. With that, I will invite Dr. Flatteau to deliver his remarks, and he will have no more than 8 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and distinguished commissioners, for this opportunity to address a very important topic. I'm going to give a brief overview of what I think are some operating principles or frameworks, and then give a few details on some of these items. And hopefully some may come up during a Q&A. An independent redistricting commission as a concept. In terms of city council districts, I believe they should be smaller in size, more districts, more council districts for the city of New York, and a smaller population deviation in drawing those districts. Secondly, the current commission in, actually it's chapter 2A of the current charter. And by the way, it is available on smartphone. The entire city charter is accessible. I was on it last night, preparing for today. The current commission is 15 members, 7 appointed by the mayor, 5 by the speaker, and 3 by the minority leader of the city council. So I'm recommending that it be more diverse and larger in size.
Let me do, we're getting some background noise, I guess from California. So people around you cannot make any noise, okay? Thank you.
A third principle, a commission whose membership is free of any conflict of interest, and some qualifications that help ensure that principle, and borrowing from the California model, as a matter of fact. Fourth, terms of office, key items like a quorum and a supermajority to approve the mapping that comes out of the redistricting process. 5, in terms of meetings and public hearings, making sure that there is more diversity and accessibility to the public for these hearings. 6, redistricting criteria, things like contiguity, compactness, adherence to voting rights requirements, et cetera. Number 7, a selection process for future redistricting commissioners that is non-governmental. And again, California has taken that concept a long ways, and I can speak with a little more detail to that. 8th, a plan approval process. Right now, the map is approved by the city council, and up until the last round, with pre-clearance by the Justice Department. That pre-clearance mechanism no longer exists, so New York City should seriously consider having its own pre-clearance review mechanism in place. So those are the overall operating principles suggested for your consideration. And now to drill down on some of these ideas. Size of a district. When the current districts were drawn after the 2010 census, there were 51 districts. They average 160,000 in size, and there's something called a 10% deviation. I'm suggesting smaller districts, the size of a current assembly district, which is about 120,000, and a smaller deviation, which would mean variation in population from district to district, 5%. You have a blue sheet in front of you, which has details on each one of these. So the numbers I'm skimming through are there. It would mean about somewhere in the range of about 70 city council districts going forward, assuming New York's population is already at 8.6 million right now, according to the Census Bureau, about 8.7 million. So assuming we don't have another massive undercount in New York City for the 2020 census, we will have very close to 9 million New Yorkers. So you can anticipate, if you anticipate that and you don't change that number 51, that means those districts are going to have even more people in them. And the basic concept is smaller the districts, the closer the government will be to the people. So that's the basis for that. The commission, there are current notions about diversity in the current Chapter 2A, but I think I've outlined a number of items that could bring more specificity to the process. For example, The second largest voter registration, and others have mentioned, there were 5 million registered voters in New York. The second largest registration is not the Republican Party. There are over 3 million Democrats. The second largest is blank enrollment. But there's no provision for someone, a registered voter in the city of New York, choice does not enroll in a political party. There's nothing in the charter that says that they could have a single voice redistricting commission when they are in fact the second largest constituency among registered voters. So there are some details there. Balancing, making sure that the boroughs, there's some parity or equity in terms of borough representation. And unapologetically as a Brooklyn chauvinist, we are now closing in on 3 million people. So Brooklyn, you should look at the population of the boroughs when you're figuring out, well, how many members of this commission, whether you go to 21, 25, should come from each of the boroughs, as well as other balancing matters such as age, race, religion, gender, sexual orientation, et cetera. I also recommend that we've been talking about a lot about millennials, basically, and our younger voters or non-voters, and we should ensure that millennials are represented on the redistricting commission going forward. You could define that as an age bracket. That's the last item under 2. California has stipulations that no person on their commission can be an elected official. And there's some layers. The next speaker, I'm sure, is going to explain, but they have several gates that an applicant to become a member of the commission has to go through. And no relative or elected official should be a member. I'm also recommending that a permanent resident category also be included. I'm an advocate that permanent residents should be allowed to vote in municipal elections. This isn't quite independent redistricting, but it's a part of this whole question we're discussing here. And
How about 1 minute remaining?
Residents could vote. They voted in school board elections, and prior to that, they voted in city elections in the last century. And we need to consider that again. A supermajority for approval process, also in terms of approval process, I think we should think about, if you want to talk about civic engagement, could you imagine if the voters of the city of New York had the opportunity to vote on a redistricting map, not just the 51 members of council? By the way, there was a little known statewide referendum in November 2014 that changed the New York State redistricting process so that in the next round, there will be no elected officials on the statewide redistricting body. So thinking about a tool for civic engagement, having the voters of New York approve a redistricting map is a recommendation. A non-governmental process, again, which they almost have in California. In California, and I may be corrected, the elected officials still have a role in paring down the applicants who wish to become members. They had tens of thousands of California residents applied to become members of their redistricting commission. You could have a similar process in New York City, and if you want to take the politics out of it, I'm suggesting in item 7, they actually, in California, it's called ARP, Applicant Review Panel. And the persons on that panel would not be elected officials. They might be members of civic groups, bar associations, community activists, anyone you choose, but politicians. And that's one way. As I pointed out, the current system, actually 3 politicians appoint the current 15 members, the mayor, the speaker, and the minority leader. I think I'm almost out of time, so let me mention 1 or 2, okay. Community access to, notice I have part 1 on there because there's more to be said. So in part 2, that's the next round, I do want to mention, though, community access to census data and mapping technology should be an important part of it. It was used, it's been utilized in previous redistricting rounds where citizens could go to certain locations, have access to computers and mapping technology. That should be a part of the process. And think of redistricting. We just finished talking about civic engagement. That could be one of those triggers, one of those largest mass civic engagement exercises, figuring out how to set up this process going forward so that individuals, communities, neighborhoods feel ownership for wanting to participate in this process and learn more about their government. And also, finally, I'll mention the 2020 census, which is the predicate for the redistricting process. That process is upon us, and if New York City does not massively engage and get counted in the 2020 census, our whole redistricting process is going to be in a shambles, will not adequately represent the people of New York. So I'll stop at that point.
Dr. Fletzo, thank you very much. We will immediately turn to Kathy Fung.
Hi, everybody. I'm just checking the voice level. Can you hear me? Right. Currently, I'm going to talk a little bit about what other states do, and then talk through some considerations that you'll want to think about. I do have a colleague, Susan Lerner, who's with Common Cause New York, who will, I think, be giving more specific recommendations for what to do. I'm going to give an overview of things that people have thought about in creating commissions around the country. Currently, the default way of thinking about drawing district lines in the United States is to have incumbent elected officials draw their own lines. However, in 13 states and in several major cities, they have created some type of commission that draws the district lines. Very quickly, the variations in those commissions can vary significantly. So it is useful to give some definition to what those are. In the early days, the states who moved to commissions often adopted a model where commissions were made up of groups of elected officials. So, for instance, your minority and majority leader of the legislature, the governor, the attorney general, or in the city council's case, it might be council president, the mayor, and the city attorney. Starting in the 1970s, commissions that were created started to move more towards being made up of citizens, but where the citizens were directly appointed by those sitting politicians. More recently, we've really been moving to a model where citizen commissioners are chosen through a process that's independent of elected officials, specifically those who are going to be running for the very districts that the commission is drawing. And so I'm going to be focusing a lot of the conversation on those commissions, including California's commission, but also the city of Boston, Sacramento, and San Diego. There are enough variations that it could be useful to look at any one of those for some guidance on what is possible in New York. I'll just note that in Los Angeles, we have an appointed commission that is made up of citizens, but that are appointed directly by our council and some of our other elected offices. And so I'll probably be referring to that as an example of something that New York doesn't want to follow. So to the extent that any of these recommendations are good examples of things that you want to distinguish from, and you can do better than LA, please feel free to do that. As you look at how you might change New York City's commission, I think one of the starting points is to figure out what the problems that you're solving for are. And I think that that guides then what the reforms that you're going to seek to be. The problem number one is that the way that lines are drawn might disregard community testimony in favor of incumbent interests or special interests or partisan interests. So one of the things that we tend to look at is who those commissioners are. Are the people who are appointed to the commission, are they candidates or likely candidates? Are they politician staff, their family, their major donors, their campaign team members? And do you want to create a list of robust conflict of interests that might exclude certain categories of people who have a direct interest in how the lines are drawn, or who might be seen to have a conflict of interest with how the lines are drawn? One of the most important things to do in creating a commission is to think about how you can increase public confidence in the maps that are ultimately drawn. And one of those ways is to remove people who might have conflicts of interest. Are there a set of positive qualifications that you want to incorporate into the selection criteria? Professor Plato talked a little bit about this, but in California, this includes, number one, an ability to be impartial, two, having an appreciation for the diversity of the state's population, three, having relevant skills and experience. California has created an application process where applicants actually answer those questions, and where there's a separate screening body that narrows the pool, reading all of those applications. And there were some 30,000 people who put their names into the hat for consideration, and ultimately who filled out all of the questions in a kind of college essay form. While it might be a process of application, one of the key things that it does is it identifies who's ready to take on this fairly time-intensive and emotionally intensive process. If you're willing to fill out, a form that involves answering some questions and doing some introspection, you might be a little bit more ready for the whole process. Related to this is how the commissioners are selected. Are the commissioners directly appointed by incumbent politicians? Is there a relatively independent body that can help you screen those applicants or possibly be involved in the selection? So again, I think you have a handout that describes the California process, but moving from a place where incumbent politicians are directly appointing might help to cut the strings from commissioners to elected officials. And additionally, finding an entity that might be able to be your first screening, provide the first screening of applicants to create a pool can help, again, to kind of get people who are extremely qualified, who are not experiencing conflicts of interest, and who then can be narrowed down to your finalists. In California, we have our state auditors who screen the applicants. You have entities like the Campaign Finance Board that might do the same. And then our legislators actually only play a role in striking the smaller pool, like jury selection, but not picking directly. The final commission is actually picked in two parts. So once we've got the pool narrowed down to 60 applicants who have been screened and interviewed and then had legislative strikes, the first 8 are randomly picked using a bingo ball type of machine. And then the last 6 are selected by the first 8 in order to ensure that there's a balance of diversity in race, ethnicity, gender, and geography. And that's pretty significant in California because we wanted to really make sure that our commissioners were as representative of all of the different diversity that the state brings. And I think that that's a priority certainly for the city of New York.
1 minute remaining.
How to make the hearing process transparent, inclusive, and meaningful. So the questions to ask are, how can we make the hearings or public meetings the only place where commissioners are discussing the maps? Do you want to have, for instance, a ban on ex parte communications, that is off-the-record communications between the commission or staff and the public, including elected officials or staff? If there's ultimately conversations that are happening between the commissioners and elected officials, you are essentially creating a backdoor that undermines public trust and certainly can have some very negative effects on the maps as they're drawn. The second is, are there requirements that the hearings happen in all parts of the city? Third, are there requirements that the people attending the hearings can be offered translation services, or bring a translator to speak? Fourth, is there a budget for the commission to be able to conduct outreach to reach those pockets of population? And then fifth, are all conversations subject to discovery if someone or some organization wants to challenge the maps? Oftentimes, those conversations are protected by legislative privilege, and creating a rule that lifts that legislative privilege can be incredibly important to making sure that everything is up and up. Finally, you should consider how the commission staff are hired and who controls the commission budget. Oftentimes, staff of the mayor or council president are conveniently loaned to the commission, and it could be worth thinking about giving the commission the budget as well as the authority to hire their executive staff, their voting rights council, their experts directly, rather than through the city council or the mayor's office. I can speak a little bit more about how to ensure that hearings and the criteria that the commission is drawing by are protective of community support. What I'll just say is that generally speaking, criteria should be prioritizing the Voting Rights Act, and that there should also be a consideration of communities of interest testimony. Additionally, making sure that there's a budget for hiring experts who can conduct racial polarized voting analysis early in the process can be incredibly helpful. So just making sure that that priority is put first before you think about all the other things that you need to do.
Thanks. Thank you very much. This has been very good. We've got one more panelist. It's James Hong, the former co-director of the Min Kwan Center for Community Action. James?
Good afternoon, everyone. Good to see you again. I had the pleasure of speaking before you, a few weeks ago in Flushing about the concerns that I had, and I think Kathy and John here have just raised so many great things that we would support in terms of, well, I would support in terms of my concerns. So I think I can just bring some just concrete examples of what happened back in 2011 with the city's redistricting process, and just from there, I can make my recommendations. So I referred to this before. In 2009, there was a candidate who a candidate who won a very racially charged election against an Asian American, and this person happened to be a protege of a longtime state senator in Eastern Queens. That state senator the next year lost his re-election bid, but then in 2012 was appointed to the districting commission. And despite many comments saying to keep a neighborhood in that district together, it seemed that there was a lot of pressure to divide that neighborhood even more deeply, and it was. And so it diluted the Asian American vote in that neighborhood in Queens. And another example was about the influence of partisan political operatives. There was a state assembly member, if you remember, who was at the time under fire for multiple counts of sexual harassment and in the process of being disciplined in his assembly post for misconduct. He was somehow thrown a lifeline by being drawn into a neighboring district in Brooklyn, sort of at the very 11th hour under sort of the dark of night. And then this became like this huge thing that the speaker then had to deal with. And I believe the districting commission and the city council at the time did not even follow the process that was laid out in the charter. They actually went against the charter pretty obviously because this had happened and they needed to correct it. There was a public outcry. So, we saw that, and there was also consistent and backroom resistance to keeping Asian American communities in Southwest Brooklyn together as well. And we saw this in multiple parts of the city, central Queens as well. But the thing is that we just constantly saw in the commission an influence of people that were either connected to incumbents or interested in party politics. So the concern or the recommendation that I had was that past elected officials should not be allowed to be part of the decision-making process on the maps, most obviously not to sit on the districting commission, and redistricting from start to finish needs to be protected from the influence of partisan operatives. I think, Kathy has said it really well. She's given a much broader sort of vision of what is good redistricting. The way that the mayor right now chooses 7, and the city council chooses 8 of the commissioners. This is, I think, problematic. Direct political appointees, we can't really expect them to be that independent. And so there needs to be a different way of choosing commission members in a process that's itself free from the influence of past or present elected officials and those connected with them. Personally, I think academics demographers, people who are really into data and really connected with their community. And community members who are really connected with their localities. I think these are the kinds of people that we want on the commission, and a robust way of screening for them is something that I brought up in the last hearing and actually referred to the California process. So I'm really glad that Kathy is here to talk about that. So yeah, that's it for my comments. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Are there questions from the commissioners? Wendy?
So I just was wanted to ask Mr. Plateau about if there were particular problems with the way the current commission is functioning that sort of led you to propose these particular changes. And I heard you speak at length about the districts sizes and changing the number of districts, and more about the other recommendations about how the commission is functioning and how to improve it. Maybe if you could speak to that.
Problems. I think that I think that imperfections were counterbalanced by the fact that in New York City you have a very robust constituency of voting rights advocates, civic organizations that kept a lot of outside pressure and keep eyes on the process. And additionally, that commission, knowing that if they did not do the right thing, inevitably their work was going to wind up in the federal courts. And the city of New York has lost several of those lawsuits, city and state of New York, in the past. So I think those, to the extent that there are imperfections in the process, you had those counterweights that helped to correct the process. Absolutely. Absolutely. So there was a Supreme Court, U.S. Supreme Court decision that didn't hit the table until 2013, after the last city council and state and congressional redistricting. Up until that time, 3 of the 5 boroughs, counties in New York City are required to pre-clear any of their political map drawing, polling place changes, any laws, policies, practices, and procedures would have to be first submitted to be reviewed by the Justice Department. And that then opened the door for any members of the public to comment during that open process as well. So I think the Voting Rights Act had a major chastening effect on imperfections and other types of activity that would otherwise take place. And my concern is that the next redistricting round, which we're moving into right now, there is no such pre-clearance mechanism in place at the federal, state, or city level, and we're about to go into another redistricting.
So this is a fault for you, and then also for Kathy Fung. Is it your testimony that these changes might make it compensate for the loss of Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act, and make it that the next round of redistricting will be more inclusive of community members and then more respectful of the values that the voting of representation that the Voting Rights Act is trying to further? And then for Kathy, the question is it your experience that in California that the model used there was consistent with also advancing more fair representation consistent with the Voting Rights Act? So
my answer would be, it's not a question of either or, we need both. I think that we can improve upon the current redistricting process that is embedded in the current city charter. And we still need some type of pre-clearance mechanism to arrive on the scene as a second clearinghouse for whatever product comes out of the next redistricting commission. Yes. Could someone roll up that slide to slide 2, if you don't mind? You'll see it. Oh.
In California, specifically because we had gone through a number of rounds where there were some fairly egregious Voting Rights Act claims that were raised by civil rights activists, including friends of ours like Malta, but where the courts consistently said that if the justification was to protect incumbent electeds, that that communities were not being divided for racial reasons, but rather to protect political interests, which was a perfectly acceptable explanation and even a traditional redistricting criteria. So in fact, actually one of the reasons why we went down the road of creating the commission and these very strong protections to ensure that the community's voice was listened to, vis-a-vis or maybe in parallel to what had always been the case, which is that powerful interests had their seat at the table, was because we knew that the courts had slowly been eroding voting rights protections and also been even eroding traditional protections under other sections of the Voting Rights Act, like Section 2. So I would say that, a lot of times what happens is that minority communities experience getting cut up or packed because they're running into another interest. Oftentimes it's the self-interest of the incumbent trying to draw a safe seat for themselves or somebody who's their successor, right? Or a friend. So to the extent that we can kind of recalibrate that so that the balance is to listen to community interests and community perspectives, it allows for the lifting up of those concerns rather than always kind of first and foremost putting incumbent or partisan interests first. So I would concur that in California, how we ended up getting, I would say, fairly responsive districts, both at the state, but also in certain cities that have adopted it as well, is looking at these twin questions, right? How do we protect communities, lift them up? And then also, how do we make sure that incumbent voices or interests, political insider interests that usually have an inside line to how these lines are drawn, don't have that special access pass. I'm going to turn this to my colleague if there are any additional questions ready to run. Dan Acuna also knows quite a bit, even more than I do about redistricting. And so if there are any additional questions for us, we'll have to. Thank you so much for allowing us to present today.
Thank you.
And good luck.
I have a follow-up question for Dr. Flateau. What is your suggestion for how to implement a local substitute for the Voting Rights Act pre-clearance process?
One thought that immediately comes to mind is modeled off of the Justice Department and the State Attorney General's office. They all have civil rights divisions already in place. So a quick approach would be to let that civil rights division, I believe it exists, within the Corporation Counsel's office. And they have they've been defending the city of New York on civil rights cases for decades now. So they have the in-house expertise. They're familiar with voting rights, civil rights, very familiar with voting rights, civil rights law, one of the largest law firms in the country. So that could be one place that we could very quickly house the pre-clearance function for the city, for municipal redistricting.
Before I turn it over to Dr. Clark, obviously the mayor appoints the Corporation Council, and they don't have the tradition that exists in the federal government of a very independent civil rights division. You yourself have some questions about the independence of the U.S. Civil Rights Division, as we all have seen over the last few years. So I'm not so sure we've got a perfect solution, but I appreciate your thoughts.
That's quick. The bureaucracy is already in place. The expertise is there. It beats a blank, which is where we stand right now.
I wanted to just ask for those of us who come from immigrant communities, with all of what's happening in Washington, how do you see a census reflecting the true numbers within communities and neighborhoods? I know in the Caribbean American community, it's going to be hard pressed to get a lot of folks who live in the attic, who live in the basement, to fill a form out and say, I am here. And then after that is afraid that ICE is going to come. So just tell me what is in your mind for communities like mine would want to focus on in order to get a true count, in order to draw a district line.
We're in a very critical period right now because the federal government just decided to add a citizenship question to the 2020 census. And the feedback I have is that it's sending shockwaves throughout immigrant New York and far beyond. So if we don't do something by way of education, outreach, assurance to New Yorkers that if and when they respond to that question, there won't be repercussions. We're in for a massive undercount, which means a further decline in our congressional representation, state legislative representation. Our city council districts are going to be huge because we'll have so many people in those districts that aren't being counted. That's going to affect our government's ability to adequately deliver goods and services to its residents. So there are massive repercussions if New York City does not now, I believe, begin working on this question of 2020 census, education, and outreach, because that's the predicate to redistricting. The numbers from that census are going to be used to redistrict. That also has, it'll affect our New York's congressional representation, and those are our counts in the Electoral College. It will also diminish New York's voice in national politics as well, and in the national legislature.
Yeah, just to also continue this line of discussion. So this is a concern of mine as well, and I hear you on the need to educate folks, though we cannot assure them that that ICE won't come after them. But I wonder if you have a specific recommendation that could be in the form of a proposal that goes to the ballot that helps to mitigate for the anticipated undercount that will likely occur. I don't know what that is, but I mean, I just wonder if any of you have any thoughts around that.
I ask a question related to that, which is, under existing law, does New York City have the ability to supplement the census count in drawing its local districts already?
The answer is no, but New York can challenge the census count. There is a process in place nationally, but New York has always lost those challenges when it has challenged the count.
But when you say no, what is the limitation on supplementing the census? I understand you can't for federal purposes.
There's only
for local.
one authorized census counter in America, and that's the U.S. Census Bureau. No other governmental jurisdiction can come along and say, wait a minute, what you can do is come up with an alternative set of numbers. This is what happened in the last census. New York City challenged its undercount because it claimed the Census Bureau missed some of the new housing units. Now think back 10 years. Compared to how many housing units are exploding all over New York City right now. New York City lost that argument before the Justice Department and on the courts 10 years ago when we tried to argue that they missed housing units with people in them. The bottom line was, too bad, so what? That was Fed's response. So you can come up with alternative analysis. What we need to do is get ahead of the process. The key agency right now is our New York City Department of City Planning. They are compiling all the data and feeding it to the Census Bureau, who then creates these, it's called the master address file. That's where they get, the addresses are coming from us right now. And then they're gonna mail out a postcard for 2020 with a passcode on it. This will be the first digital census in US history. The push is for, and that's another problem. We have a digital divide here in New York City. It ties into our education process. It ties into language issues in the immigrant community, et cetera. So we have a lot of work to do, and talking about redistricting will be moot if we don't get on top of the 2020 census. And then that will have all the numbers we'll need to maximize our political voice and representation, if those two tasks are handled correctly and in tandem.
I just want to add just one quick comment. The inclusion of the citizenship question is actually part of a larger effort by some people in this country to eventually draw districts based on citizens alone, which would have disastrous impacts, at any level of government and in any jurisdiction, definitely disenfranchising minority and immigrant communities. So, it may be something that the commission considers, whether to codify drawing districts based on residents and like people rather than citizens.
The hour draws late. I want to thank the panelists, including those who are remotely participating. This has been very, very helpful. I mean, these last comments have brought it all together. Getting people engaged in the census is something that a volunteer office could do. I mean, it's all melding in the minds of this commission, so that I do very much appreciate your comments and your testimony. Thank you very, very much. And I think we have, I know, the meeting is adjourned. Thank you.
Last 5 days, when they called me and asked me to come in. A lot of this swirling around in the brain. Dale working on the California mine years ago.
Oh, really?
Hi.
Hi, I'm Rachel Bloom. I'm the Director of Public Policy at Citizens Union.
Oh,